Imagine walking through stone corridors where the silence weighs 3 tons per square foot. Adelaide Gaol, 1836 to 1988, 147 years of operation. But here's the number that will stop your breath. 45 of South Australia's 66 hangings happened inside these walls. 68% of an entire colony's executions concentrated in one building that was supposed to prove civilization could reform criminals instead of killing them. They called it a free colony. No convicts, no chains, no need for cages. 4 years later, they were floating prisoners on the HMS Buffalo because their paradise had already failed. By 1840, they were commissioning a permanent jail with a price tag of £12,000, 24 years of average wages, to build a machine for breaking human souls. The architect was George Strickland Kingston. His blueprint promised reform through geometry, salvation through surveillance, moral correction through architectural oppression. What he delivered was something else entirely, a factory that would process human beings through stages of punishment, ending in a room specifically designed for judicial killing. But the most terrifying part wasn't the hangings. It wasn't the treadmill that ground prisoners into flour. It wasn't even the hanging tower that converted watching into elimination. It was how normal it all became. Death as scheduled procedure, brutality as administrative routine. A building that taught an entire society that some people could be reformed and others simply needed to be removed. Today, we open the files on the longest-running prison experiment in Australian history. We're going inside the stone walls, through the execution records, into the architectural psychology of a building that made systematic cruelty feel like systematic justice. This is the story of how a free colony built a machine for manufacturing fear, and why that machine worked exactly as designed. If you're ready to examine what happens when democracy builds institutions that contradict democratic values, when progress creates regress, when the cure becomes worse than the disease, then join me as we unlock Adelaide Gaol's darkest secrets. Because some buildings remember everything, and this one has been waiting a very long time to tell its story. They called it a free colony. South Australia, 1836. No convicts, no chains, no need for cages. The colony's founding charter reads like a prayer to human nature. Men would arrive free, work free, live free. Crime would find no foothold in this carefully planned paradise beside the Southern Sea. But freedom is an expensive myth, and myths have a way of rotting from the inside. 4 years. That's all it took. 4 years for the colony's pristine reputation to crack like cheap mortar. By 1840, the HMS Buffalo sat anchored in the harbor, its hull transformed into South Australia's first floating prison. The ship that had carried hopeful settlers now held their failures, rocking gently in the same waters that had welcomed them. The irony wasn't lost on Adelaide's residents. They could see the Buffalo from the shore, its masts piercing the horizon like accusatory fingers. Every sunset painted those masts black against the sky, a daily reminder that their free colony had already compromised its founding promise. No convicts, they had said. No prisons necessary. The Buffalo held 23 men in 1840. 23 failures of the grand experiment. 23 reasons why the colony needed what it had sworn never to build. A permanent jail. The ship's hold stank of sweat and desperation, but it served its purpose. It kept the problem floating, literally offshore where it couldn't contaminate the colony's carefully cultivated reputation. But ships are temporary solutions to permanent problems. Wood rots, iron rusts, and men grow restless when they're caged in something that sways with every tide. The site they chose sat 3/4 of a mile northwest of Adelaide's centre, near the River Torrens, close enough to the city for guards to reach quickly, far enough to keep the screaming from disturbing decent people's sleep. The location itself was a compromise wrapped in practical language. Officials spoke of convenient access and adequate security. What they meant was, we need somewhere to hide our shame. The river provided water, they said. The distance provided perspective. The slight elevation provided good drainage. All true, all carefully selected to mask the deeper truth. South Australia was about to build a machine for breaking human beings, and they needed somewhere to put it that wouldn't remind them daily of their failure. The land was cheap, government-owned. No one would miss it. No one would mourn when they surrounded it with walls. It was, as colonial administrators like to say, suitable for the purpose, a phrase that managed to sound both official and completely empty of meaning. Within 4 years of declaring themselves free from the stain of convict labor, South Australia was commissioning its first permanent prison. The irony tasted like copper in the mouths of the legislators who signed the authorization. But irony doesn't pay bills, fear does. And by 1840, fear was the colony's fastest-growing industry. Crime had arrived faster than infrastructure, faster than proper roads, faster than adequate housing. But not faster than human nature, which had been waiting in South Australia all along, patient as stone, inevitable as weather. The colony had believed in its own marketing. Men would behave because they were free to behave. No convict background meant no criminal inclinations. A fresh start meant fresh morals. But freedom, it turned out, was just another word for choice. And some people choose poorly. Theft, assault, public drunkenness. The catalog of colonial crime read like a manual on how to disappoint your founding fathers. Each offense chipped away at the colony's moral authority. Each arrest proved that human nature traveled well, survived ocean voyages, and adapted quickly to new climates. By 1840, the HMS Buffalo was holding men whose crimes ranged from petty theft to assault with intent. The ship's manifest had become a ledger of broken promises. Each name represented not just a criminal act, but a failure of the colonial vision. These men weren't supposed to exist. The free colony had no theoretical space for them, so they built practical space instead. The decision came down from Governor George Gawler himself. A permanent jail, stone walls, iron bars, all the machinery of punishment that South Australia had proudly declared it would never need. The authorization carried a price tag of £12,000, a sum that represented roughly 24 years of the average laborer's wages. £12,000 to build a building dedicated to the proposition that freedom wasn't enough, that some people needed walls to remind them how to behave. That South Australia's grand experiment had lasted exactly 4 years and 3 months, but authorization is just paperwork. Buildings require blueprints, and blueprints require architects who understand the specific mathematics of human misery. They gave the pencil to George Strickland Kingston, civil engineer, architect, a man who had studied the latest thinking on prison design from England and America. Kingston had ideas about geometry and morality, about how the shape of a space could reshape the soul inside it. He believed in the power of stone to teach lessons that words could not. Kingston's design drew inspiration from Pentonville Prison in London, the newest thinking in what they called separate system incarceration. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. Classify prisoners by their crimes, separate them by their souls, and let solitude do what society had failed to accomplish. Reform through isolation. Redemption through architectural control. The plan that emerged from Kingston's drafting table looked like half a clock face, a partial decagon with yards arranged like slices of pie, each one visible from a central guard tower, lines of sight like commandments carved in stone. Every corner planned, every shadow calculated, every potential hiding place eliminated by careful geometry. The mathematics were precise. The capacity was theoretical. 140 prisoners, Kingston estimated, 140 souls that South Australia expected to process, classify, reform, and return to society as functioning citizens. The number felt both large and small. Large enough to handle the colony's current crime problem. Small enough to suggest the problem was temporary. Critics would later call them imaginary prisoners. Kiev, the men and women who might someday fill Kingston's carefully calculated cells. Theoretical criminals for a theoretical building designed to solve a problem that everyone hoped would solve itself. But hope is not an engineering principle. And South Australia was about to learn that some problems grow faster than the buildings meant to contain them. Kingston's blueprint showed 5 yards radiating from the central tower like spokes on a wheel, each yard designed for a specific classification of prisoner. Debtors here, petty criminals there, serious offenders in the center, where the tower's gaze could find them at all hours. The design promised total surveillance with minimal staff, efficiency through architecture, control through careful calculation. But blueprints exist in 2 dimensions, buildings exist in 3, and the third dimension is where problems hide. The tower would rise 40 feet above the yards, Kingston planned, high enough to see over every wall, into every corner, through every shadow. The guard station there would command the entire complex like a general surveying a battlefield. 1 man, 5 yards, perfect visibility. The mathematics of power reduced to its simplest formula. The cells themselves would be 8 feet by 4 feet by 9 feet high, 32 square feet of floor space per human being, about the size of a large closet, big enough to lie down in, small enough to go insane in. Kingston had calculated the minimum space required to house a human body, but not the maximum space a human spirit could endure. Each cell would have a window, not for comfort, but for classification. The separate system required prisoners to see sky but not each other, natural light without natural contact. The window would be barred naturally and positioned high enough that a man could see heaven but not the horizon. The walls would be built of local stone. Adelaide had plenty of stone. Quarries near the river provided limestone and sandstone, materials that would weather the decades while maintaining their moral authority. Stone didn't compromise. Stone didn't forgive. Stone remembered every impact and returned it with interest. But stone costs money, and money, in South Australia, was already running short. Governor Gawler approved Kingston's design in 1840. The first stone was laid before the year ended. But approval and completion live in different centuries, sometimes, especially when governments change their minds as often as they change their budgets. Before the mortar had time to cure, politics touched the blueprint. Gawler decided Kingston's design wasn't quite right. Not impressive enough, perhaps. Not secure enough, certainly. Not expensive enough to satisfy a governor who had expensive tastes and a colonial administration willing to fund them. The changes began small. An extra tower here, upgraded stonework there, architectural improvements that sounded reasonable in committee meetings and catastrophic in contractor meetings. Each modification cascaded through the construction schedule like cracks through green mortar. Barrow and Goodyear held the construction contract. They had bid on Kingston's original design, calculated their costs around Kingston's original specifications, and signed legal documents promising to deliver Kingston's original vision. What they got instead was a governor who treated blueprints like rough suggestions and budgets like starting points for negotiation. By 1842, the project had transformed into something that resembled warfare more than construction. Barrow and Goodyear submitted claims for the extra work. The government rejected the claims. Arbitration hearings stretched into months. Legal fees multiplied like infection. And all the while, the half-finished jail sat beside the River Torrens like an accusation made of stone. Contemporary newspapers caught the scent of scandal. £34,000 has been thrown away, one editorial declared, on a libel against a well-disposed population. The building that was supposed to protect South Australia's reputation was already devouring it. Every month of delay, every new cost overrun, every fresh arbitration hearing reminded colonists that their free society had become an expensive prisoner of its own contradictions. The legal battle stretched nearly 20 years. 20 years of lawyers arguing about stone and mortar while the jail itself sat half-complete, a monument to bureaucratic incompetence. 20 years of interest accumulating on borrowed money. 20 years of parliamentary committees trying to explain how a £12,000 building had become a £34,000 embarrassment. But embarrassment doesn't stop crime, and crime doesn't wait for construction schedules. By 1841, the pressure had become unbearable. South Australia needed a working jail, half-finished or not. The HMS Buffalo could only hold so many men, and the colony's crime rate showed no signs of accommodating architectural delays, so they opened Adelaide Gaol with a quarter of Kingston's vision complete. One governor, 2 turnkeys, 2 guards, and about 40 cells that might or might not keep prisoners inside. The staffing was skeletal by design. 6 men to run a complex built for 140 prisoners. The mathematics didn't work, but the mathematics had never been South Australia's strength. They were improvising now, building the plane while flying it, learning to operate a prison while prisoners watched them figure out which keys opened which doors. The governor was James Walton, a man whose qualifications for running a prison consisted mainly of being willing to live inside one. He had worked as a constable, but constable work involved chasing criminals through streets, not managing them behind walls. Prison work was different, closer, more personal. Constables could go home at night. Prison governors lived with their failures. Walton's staff consisted of 2 turnkeys and 2 guards. The turnkeys managed the keys, who got fed when cells opened, which prisoners moved where. The guards managed the bodies, who fought whom when violence erupted, which prisoners couldn't be left alone together. 4 men to handle every crisis that arose in a building designed to generate crises. The segregation system failed immediately. Kingston's careful classification scheme required separate yards for separate categories of prisoners. But Kingston's separate yards didn't exist yet. Only 2 yards had been completed, and they had to hold every type of prisoner the colony produced: debtors, thieves, assault cases, public drunks, and women. Women posed the most immediate problem. The separate system assumed male and female prisoners would never see each other, never communicate, never share space or air or guards. But Adelaide Gaol had been built around male assumptions, male geometry, male theories of reform. Women existed in the architectural margins, the dead spaces between inner and outer walls where Kingston had never planned for anyone to live. The women's quarters occupied a gap in Kingston's blueprint, a leftover space where the inner wall didn't quite meet the outer wall, creating a narrow corridor about 8 feet wide and running the length of the building's north side. It wasn't designed as living space. It had evolved into living space because evolution beats planning, when planning forgets that half the human race is female. 8 feet wide, maybe 120 feet long. That was the women's world at Adelaide Gaol, a corridor with cells carved into the walls like slots in a filing cabinet. No yard access, no sunlight except what filtered through the gap between walls, no privacy except what 4 stone walls and a locked door could provide. The first official complaint came in 1841, less than a year after the jail opened. Immorality between guards and female prisoners, the report said. Improper conduct in the narrow spaces where men with keys met women without choices. The details were left deliberately vague, but the implications were written in the architectural language of confined space and unsupervised access. The government's solution revealed everything about their priorities. Fire the guards, don't redesign the space. Blame the men, don't question the geometry. Solve the problem with personnel changes, not architectural modifications. It was cheaper to replace guards than rebuild walls. Cheaper to shift blame than shift blueprints. No official matron was appointed until 1850. For 9 years, women prisoners lived in architectural afterthought, supervised by men, confined in space designed for storage rather than habitation. 9 years of problems that could have been solved with planning, but were instead managed with cost-cutting and moral compromise. But the real innovation was still coming. The separation of bodies had proved difficult, expensive, sometimes impossible. So Adelaide Gaol would try a more ambitious experiment: the separation of souls. The second stage of construction began in 1847, 7 years after the first stone, 6 years after opening. The jail finally began to resemble Kingston's original vision. Outer walls rose 20 feet high, topped with iron spikes that caught sunlight like teeth. Interior walls divided the complex into 5 distinct yards, each one separated from its neighbors by barriers 10 feet high and 2 feet thick. This was the architecture of moral classification. Yard 1 for debtors and minor offenders, Yard 2 for property crimes, Yard 3 for crimes of violence, Yard 4 for women and juvenile offenders, Yard 5 for the condemned and the incorrigible. Each prisoner assigned to a category, each category assigned to a space, each space designed to prevent contamination from every other space. The bricks came from kilns near the River Torrens. Local clay transformed into architectural control. Approximately 400,000 bricks, each one shaped by hand, fired in ovens that burned for days, transported by cart to the jail site where they would form walls that would stand for the next century and a half. 400,000 identical units of confinement, stacked and mortared into a machine for manufacturing remorse. The stone for coping, the protective caps that crowned each wall, came from the government farm at Belair, 15 miles south of Adelaide. Quarried sandstone cut to specification, hauled by ox cart across colonial roads that turned to mud in winter and dust in summer. Each piece shaped to fit precisely against its neighbors, creating joints that would shed rain for decades while preventing escape for generations. Supply chains turning landscape into confinement. Raw materials flowing from river and quarry into a building designed to process human raw materials. The economic geography of punishment mapped across South Australia like a circulatory system, feeding the jail's growing appetite for stone and mortar and iron and the political will to use them. The outer walls enclosed approximately 3 acres. 3 acres of controlled space in a colony that stretched from the Southern Ocean to the desert interior. A tiny pocket of absolute government authority in a landscape where authority usually dispersed like smoke on the wind. Inside these walls, every square foot belonged to the state. Every shadow fell under official control. 10-foot-high interior walls divided the yards like chapters in a book about human classification. Each wall topped with broken glass set in mortar, a decorative touch that served notice. Climbing was not an architectural option. The glass caught sunlight during the day and moonlight during the night, creating a constellation of sharp edges that reminded prisoners that even the sky belonged to someone else. But walls were just the beginning. The real innovation was what happened between them. The treadmill arrived in the 1850s. 8 prisoners at once, stepping nowhere for hours at a time, their collective effort powering a mill that ground wheat into flour at the rate of 3 to 4 bushels per hour. Engineering as theology, muscle as moral instruction, fatigue as the pathway to compliance. The mathematics were precise. 8 men, stepping in rhythm, could generate approximately 1 horsepower of sustained effort. 1 horsepower could turn millstones that weighed half a ton each. The millstones could process grain that fed the colony's growing population. The prisoners could process shame that fed the colony's growing sense of moral authority. The treadmill stood 15 feet long and 8 feet high, its wooden steps worn smooth by countless feet that climbed toward nothing. No destination except exhaustion, no arrival except collapse. The machine taught a simple lesson. Effort without progress was the natural state of criminal existence. Keep moving, get nowhere, learn humility through endless repetition. A bell marked the rhythm. Step up, step down, step up, step down. 8 bells per minute, 480 per hour, 3,840 per shift. Each bell a hammer blow against the illusion that crime led anywhere except this. Mechanical repetition under official supervision, energy harvested for purposes the criminal would never control. The guards called it hard labor, but labor suggested productivity, purpose, the transformation of effort into value. The treadmill was more honest. It was effort transformed into punishment, energy converted into submission, human power harvested by a machine designed to teach men that their power belonged to someone else. The mill complex included grinding stones, sorting screens, and storage bins for processed grain. The prisoners' work fed Adelaide's bakeries, but more importantly, it fed Adelaide's sense that crime was being converted into something useful. Criminals transformed into generators, punishment transformed into flour, justice transformed into a business model that actually produced revenue. But the most ominous addition was yet to come. A reaping machine, attached to the mill complex like a mechanical afterthought. a device designed to harvest grain from fields, now powered by men who had reaped what they had sown, and were learning that harvest time lasted longer than they had ever imagined. The reaping machine sat in the corner of the mill house like a sleeping predator, its blades sharp enough to cut through wheat stalks in a single pass, its gears precise enough to separate grain from chaff with mechanical efficiency, its purpose unclear enough to generate rumors that spread through the jail like disease. Some prisoners whispered that the machine was meant for them, that the state planned to harvest something other than grain, that the blades could be repurposed, the gears redirected, the mechanism adapted for uses that no one wanted to name out loud, but everyone understood in the language of institutional dread. The truth was probably simpler. The reaping machine existed because it could, because the mill generated power that needed somewhere to go, because mechanical efficiency demanded that every available horsepower be harnessed to some productive purpose. But truth and rumor live in different buildings. And in a jail, rumor spreads faster than fact, because rumor answers the question that fact avoids. What are they really planning to do with us? With the treadmill operational, and the yards divided and the walls complete, Adelaide Gaol had become something new in South Australia. Not just a building, but a machine. Not just a punishment, but a system. Not just a place where criminals went, but a place where criminals were processed, classified, ground down like grain between millstones, and either reformed into something useful or discarded as waste. But every machine needs a ritual to prove it works, something public, undeniable, and final, something that demonstrates the system's ultimate authority over the bodies it processes, something that answers the question every prisoner asks but never voices. What happens to people who refuse to be reformed? Adelaide Gaol was about to provide that answer. In public, at the front gate, with crowds in the thousands watching the state demonstrate what it had learned about the intersection of justice and theater, punishment and entertainment, death and civic education. The machine was complete. Now it needed to show what it could do. But machines, even machines for processing human souls, don't operate in isolation. They exist within larger systems of power, economics, and social control that determine their ultimate purpose. Adelaide Gaol had been built to solve South Australia's crime problem, but crime problems are never just about crime. They're about order, authority, the state's monopoly on violence, and the public's appetite for moral theater. By the late 1840s, Adelaide's population had swollen to nearly 15,000 souls. Immigrants arrived monthly from England, Scotland, Ireland, bringing their hopes, their desperation, and their old-world grudges to a new-world setting that had no patience for gradual assimilation. The collision between established colonial society and fresh immigrant poverty generated friction that manifested as crime, public disorder, and demands for government action. The jail's location, near the River Torrens, placed it at the intersection of Adelaide's respectable neighborhoods and its industrial margins, close enough to the city center that officials could reach it quickly when crisis demanded, close enough to the river that supplies could be delivered by cart along established routes, close enough to everything that mattered, but separated by just enough distance and just enough walls to maintain the illusion that crime was a problem that could be contained, managed, and ultimately solved through proper application of architectural authority. The morning bell at Adelaide Gaol rang at 6, not because 6 was the optimal time to begin a day of punishment, but because 6 was early enough to establish that time itself belonged to the state. Prisoners woke when the state decided they should wake. They ate when the state provided food. They worked when the state demanded labor. They slept when the state extinguished the lights. Every hour belonged to someone else. The daily routine had been crafted with the precision of a religious service. Morning inspection at 6:15, breakfast at 7, work detail assignment at 8, 4 hours of labor, midday meal, 4 more hours of labor, evening meal, 1 hour of supervised exercise, lights out at 8, 12 hours of official darkness in which prisoners could contemplate their crimes and plan their reform. But contemplation, like everything else in the jail, required proper architectural support. The cells had been designed for meditation, not comfort. 8 feet by 4 feet of floor space, just enough room to pace 3 steps in any direction, just small enough that pacing became futile after the first few days. The walls stood close enough to touch from the center of the cell, close enough that a man with outstretched arms could brush both sides simultaneously. The silence was perhaps the most carefully engineered feature of Kingston's design. Stone walls 3 feet thick absorbed sound like ocean depths. Conversations in adjacent cells required shouting, which attracted guard attention, which resulted in punishment that made conversation seem less important than survival. Within weeks, most prisoners learned to live inside their own heads, where thoughts echoed like prayers in an empty cathedral. Food arrived through a slot in the door. Bread, soup, occasionally meat that might once have been part of an animal. Portions calculated to maintain life without encouraging comfort. The colonial government had studied prison nutrition with the same precision they applied to prison architecture. Enough calories to prevent starvation, not enough flavor to suggest that crime led to anything resembling pleasure. Water came from the river Torrens, filtered through sand and gravel, stored in cisterns that collected rainwater during Adelaide's brief winter wet season. Clean water by colonial standards, clean enough to drink, clean enough to wash with, clean enough to remind prisoners that basic human needs were privileges granted by administrative grace, not rights inherent to human existence. The workshops had been positioned to maximize both productivity and surveillance. Carpenters worked under guard supervision, their tools counted at the beginning and end of each shift. Blacksmiths forged hardware for colonial construction projects, their hammers striking iron in rhythms that could be heard throughout the complex. Tailors mended clothing and stitched canvas, their needles sharp enough to be dangerous, their work important enough to the colony's economy that security precautions had to balance supervision with efficiency. But the treadmill remained the jail's signature innovation, the machine that converted human energy into colonial flour, while simultaneously converting criminal identity into institutional compliance. 8 positions, 8 prisoners, 8 sets of legs climbing toward exhaustion and wisdom, and the kind of submission that only comes from understanding that resistance costs more energy than surrender. The treadmill operated 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, with shifts rotating every 2 hours to prevent collapse and maintain some minimal pretense that the work was corrective rather than simply destructive. Prisoners assigned to treadmill duty learned to measure time not in minutes or hours, but in steps. Thousands of steps that led nowhere, accumulated nothing, achieved no goal except the demonstration that their bodies belonged to the state. The grinding stones powered by the treadmill were imported from France, cut from a quarry that had supplied millstones for centuries, shaped by craftsmen who understood the specific geometry required to crush grain into flour without crushing the grain into dust. Each stone weighed nearly a ton, their surfaces carved with grooves that guided wheat kernels between upper and lower surfaces, where pressure and rotation performed the ancient alchemy of turning raw grain into food. The flour produced by treadmill labor fed Adelaide's bakeries, but it also fed something less tangible, the colonial sense that punishment could be productive, that criminal energy could be harvested for legitimate purposes, that the jail was not just a cost center, but a contributor to colonial prosperity. Every loaf of bread baked from jail ground flour carried the invisible flavor of reformed criminality, retribution transformed into sustenance. The reaping machine attachment represented the next logical step in this economic theology. If criminal labor could power mills, why shouldn't it power every mechanical innovation that colonial ingenuity could devise? The machine stood ready to process grain, but its presence suggested larger possibilities. Criminal energy as the driving force behind colonial industrialization. The jail as South Australia's first experiment in human-powered manufacturing. But the most powerful machine in Adelaide Gaol was not mechanical. It was social, psychological, administrative. It was the machine that took human beings who had broken colonial law and processed them into examples that taught the rest of colonial society what happened to people who broke colonial law. This machine operated not through gears and pulleys, but through rumors and fears and public demonstrations that proved the state's ultimate authority over individual life and death. And this machine was about to demonstrate its power in the most public way possible, not hidden behind stone walls where only guards and prisoners could witness its operation, not buried in administrative reports where only officials could calculate its efficiency, but staged at the front gate of the jail, where thousands of Adelaide residents could gather to watch the state exercise its most fundamental power, the power to end a human life for the sake of public order. The machine was complete. The ritual was about to begin, and Adelaide was about to learn what its free colony had built when it decided that some people needed to be caged and some cages needed to be final. The crowd began gathering before dawn. Hundreds of people, then thousands, flowing toward Adelaide Gaol like water toward a drain. They came from the city center and the suburban margins, from farms and workshops and counting houses, drawn by the promise of witnessing something that rarely happened but always mattered, the state demonstrating its ultimate authority over individual life. Public hangings had been part of colonial justice since the colony's first crime wave. But Adelaide Gaol's executions were different. They were theater performed on a purpose-built stage, with stone walls as backdrop and iron gates as proscenium arch. The jail's front facade had been designed with this moment in mind: imposing enough to command respect, accessible enough to accommodate audiences, theatrical enough to transform death into civic education. The first execution occurred while the jail was still under construction, 1841, less than a year after the building opened. Michael Magee, convicted of murder, walked from his cell to a scaffold erected just outside the front gate, while masons were still laying stones for walls that wouldn't be completed for another 7 years. His death inaugurated the building before the building was even finished, as if the state couldn't wait for architecture to catch up with its appetite for finality. The scaffold stood 15 feet high, visible from a quarter-mile away. Its platform large enough for the condemned man, the executioner, a chaplain, and whoever else official protocol demanded. The rope hung from a crossbeam that had been painted black, not for aesthetic reasons, but because black paint lasted longer under weather that could range from scorching summer heat to winter rain that turned dust into mud and stone into slippery hazard. Magee's execution drew nearly 3,000 spectators, 3,000 people who had better things to do with their morning, but chose instead to watch a man die for the crime of taking another man's life. They stood in the morning sun, pressed against each other, sharing the communal experience of witnessing justice reduced to its most fundamental form: one human being killing another human being in the name of law and order. The timing was precise: 8 o'clock in the morning, when the light was good and the crowd was sober and the symbolism was unmistakable. Morning executions suggested that death was the beginning of something, not the end. The start of justice, not the conclusion of crime. The dawn of a day when colonial society could feel safer, because one dangerous person had been permanently removed from circulation. But safety was only part of the spectacle. The real purpose was education, moral instruction delivered through the most visceral medium available. The sight of a human body falling through space, jerking to a stop, swaying slightly in whatever breeze happened to be blowing through Adelaide that morning. The crowd learned what crime cost. The state learned what power looked like when exercised without compromise. The routine was choreographed with military precision. Prisoner marched from cell to scaffold. Chaplain delivered final blessing. Executioner positioned rope. Official read death warrant. Signal given. Trapdoor opened. Body fell. Crowd dispersed. Lesson completed. But the lesson was more complex than simple deterrence. The crowd didn't just see death. They saw official death, sanctioned death, death with paperwork and procedure and religious blessing. Death that followed rules, respected protocol, acknowledged the human dignity of the condemned man, even while ending his human existence. Death that was civilized, regulated, morally defensible. This was the difference between murder and execution, crime and punishment, chaos and order. The same physical event, one person causing another person to die, transformed by context, authority, public witness. The crowd learned that killing was wrong when individuals did it, righteous when the state did it. necessary when society's survival depended on removing people who couldn't or wouldn't follow society's rules. The economics of public execution were almost as carefully calculated as the moral mathematics. 3,000 spectators meant 3,000 people who weren't working that morning, but who were instead receiving free education in the consequences of criminal behavior. The lost productivity was offset by the gained social control. The cost of staging the execution was balanced against the savings generated by deterring future crime. Adelaide's businesses learned to plan around execution days. Hotels filled with visitors from outlying areas who wanted to witness the spectacle. Taverns opened early to serve breakfast to crowds who would spend hours standing in the sun. Street vendors sold food and drink to people who had made public execution into a social event, complete with refreshments and conversation, and the kind of communal bonding that comes from sharing an intense experience. Children attended these events, not hidden away or protected from the reality of capital punishment, but brought along as part of their moral education. Parents believed that witnessing the consequences of crime would prevent their children from ever choosing criminal paths. The sight of a man dying for his crimes was considered valuable instruction, more powerful than sermons or schoolbooks or parental warnings. But the most powerful educational element wasn't the execution itself. It was the waiting. The crowd gathered hours before the appointed time, creating anticipation that built like pressure in a sealed container. Conversations spread through the assembly. What had the condemned man done? How many people had he killed? Did he deserve to die? Was justice being served? These conversations were the real curriculum. Not just the final moment when the trapdoor opened, but the hours of discussion that preceded it. The crowd educated itself about crime and punishment, law and morality, the social contract that bound colonial society together. By the time the execution began, every spectator had been transformed into a participant in the moral reasoning that justified what they were about to witness. The jail's front gate became a natural amphitheater. The building's stone facade provided acoustic backdrop that reflected sound back toward the crowd. The elevated position of the scaffold ensured visibility from hundreds of yards away. The iron gates could be opened or closed to control access, creating the illusion of exclusivity while actually accommodating thousands of people. But the most important architectural feature was invisible. The sightlines that connected the scaffold to every cell window in the jail. Prisoners could see what happened to people who graduated from Adelaide Gaol's most advanced program. The execution was performed for the crowd's education, but also for the prisoners' instruction. The message was clear. This building processes people, and some people get processed all the way to the end. The 1840s and 50s brought a steady stream of public executions. Men convicted of murder, rape, armed robbery, crimes that colonial society considered so dangerous that public death was the only adequate response. Each execution followed the same script, but each one taught slightly different lessons about the specific boundaries that separated acceptable behavior from fatal transgression. Thomas Jeffries, hanged in 1852 for murdering his wife. James McNamara, executed in 1854 for killing a shopkeeper during a robbery. William Johnson, hanged in 1856 for rape and assault. Each name became part of Adelaide's unofficial curriculum in the costs of criminal behavior. The crowd sizes varied with the fame of the criminal and the heinousness of the crime. Ordinary murders drew hundreds of spectators. Particularly brutal crimes or notorious criminals could draw thousands. The largest crowds gathered for executions that involved multiple victims or crimes that had generated newspaper coverage across the colonies. These became regional events, drawing visitors from hundreds of miles away. But by the middle 1850s, something was changing in colonial attitudes toward public execution. The spectacle that had once seemed like necessary public education was beginning to feel like public entertainment. The crowds were becoming too large, too boisterous, too eager to witness death as recreational activity rather than moral instruction. Newspaper editorials began questioning whether public hangings served their intended purpose. Did the sight of official killing actually deter crime? Or did it simply provide excuse for public gatherings that resembled carnivals more than church services? Were spectators learning respect for law and order, or were they learning to enjoy the sight of human suffering? Religious leaders joined the questioning. The Reverend Dr. Vaughan of Trinity Church argued that public executions brutalized spectators rather than educating them. The sight of death, he suggested, should inspire contemplation and remorse, not excitement and entertainment. Private executions would serve justice without feeding what he called the appetite for morbid spectacle. Colonial administrators found themselves caught between competing pressures. Public executions had always been justified as deterrence, but deterrence required publicity. If executions happened in secret, how would they prevent crime? But if executions happened in public, how could officials control the crowds that gathered to watch them? The solution came from England, where Parliament had recently passed legislation requiring all executions to take place within prison walls. Private death, official witnesses, minimal publicity. Justice served without circus atmosphere. The example of the mother country provided colonial administrators with cover for a policy change that many had wanted, but few had dared to advocate. In 1858, South Australia enacted legislation requiring all future executions to take place inside Adelaide Gaol. The front gate would no longer serve as theatre. The scaffold would move from public space to institutional space. Death would retreat from spectacle into secrecy, from education into administration. The last public execution occurred on a cold morning in August 1858. Patrick Kenneth, convicted of murdering a fellow Irishman during a drunken argument, walked from his cell to the scaffold, while nearly 2,000 people watched from beyond the gates. But this time, they knew they were watching the end of an era. After Kenneth died, executions would happen behind walls where only official witnesses could see them. The crowd's behavior that morning was different, more subdued, more respectful, as if they understood that they were witnessing not just a man's death, but the death of a tradition that had defined colonial justice for nearly 20 years. When Kenneth's body stopped swaying, the crowd dispersed, more quietly than usual. Many people walked away without the conversations that usually followed public executions. There was nothing to discuss. They had seen the last of something, and everyone knew it. But moving executions inside the jail didn't make them disappear. It concentrated them, like pressure in a sealed vessel. The crowds no longer gathered outside the gates, but the executions continued inside the walls, in spaces designed for concealment rather than display, witnessed by officials rather than citizens, recorded in documents rather than public memory. The jail's gangway became the new execution ground. The narrow space between inner and outer walls, where women prisoners had once lived in architectural afterthought. A corridor 8 feet wide and running the length of the building's north side, where portable gallows could be erected and dismantled according to need rather than spectacle. The portable gallows were a technological innovation born of practical necessity. Rather than maintaining a permanent scaffold, the jail could construct execution apparatus as needed, then dismantle it when the job was done. The components stored in a workshop, the knowledge stored in the minds of officials who had learned the specific carpentry of judicial death. The first private execution occurred in 1861. John Williams, convicted of murdering a gold prospector near the Murray River. Williams died in the gangway between walls, his death witnessed by a sheriff, a chaplain, a doctor, and 2 guards. No crowd, no public education, no community gathering to witness the state's ultimate assertion of authority over individual life. But the absence of crowds didn't reduce the execution's impact on the prisoners who remained inside the jail. They could hear the sounds, footsteps in the corridor, the chaplain's prayers, the scraping of wood against stone as the gallows were positioned. They could feel the silence that followed, a silence that lasted exactly as long as it took for a human body to stop moving at the end of a rope. The gangway executions taught different lessons than the public hangings had taught. Where public executions had educated colonial society about the costs of crime, private executions educated prisoners about the finality of justice. The message was no longer broadcast to thousands of spectators. It was delivered directly to the men and women who lived inside the walls, who heard every sound and understood every implication. Between 1861 and 1883, 13 prisoners died in the gangway, 13 portable scaffolds erected and dismantled, 13 lessons in the ultimate consequences of refusing the jail's program of moral reform, 13 demonstrations that some people couldn't be reformed, only removed. The phrase "between walls" appeared in official reports with the frequency of religious repetition. Executed between walls. Death occurred between walls. Justice administered between walls. The walls had become the defining feature of execution, more important than the crime, the criminal, or the punishment itself. Death had been architecturally contained. But architectural containment created its own problems. Where public executions had dispersed their psychological impact across thousands of spectators, private executions concentrated that impact among the few dozen people who lived and worked inside the jail. Guards who had to witness death as part of their job description. Prisoners who had to live with the knowledge that they occupied cells in a building where death was a regularly scheduled administrative function. The jail's internal atmosphere changed after executions moved inside. The building that had once been a machine for reform became a machine for something darker and more permanent. The possibility of execution hung over every prisoner like weather that could turn fatal without warning. Not just the condemned prisoners, but all prisoners, because all prisoners now understood that the building possessed the machinery to kill them if circumstances demanded. The guards changed too. Men who had signed up to supervise criminals found themselves required to witness executions as part of their duties. Some requested transfer to other positions. Others developed drinking problems. A few quit altogether, preferring unemployment to the psychological strain of working in a building where death was processed as routinely as mail or meals or morning inspections. But the most profound change was in the building itself. Adelaide Gaol had been designed as a machine for transforming criminals into productive citizens. The cells, yards, workshops, and treadmill all served that transformative purpose. But the addition of execution capability changed the machine's fundamental character. It was no longer just a place where people were reformed. It was a place where some people were reformed and other people were killed. And the difference between reform and death could hinge on decisions made by judges who would never have to live inside the walls where those decisions were carried out. The jail learned that secrecy didn't erase violence, it concentrated violence, like heat in a furnace or pressure in a steam engine. The energy that had once dispersed through public spectacle now accumulated inside stone walls, where it would remain for decades, influencing every conversation, every decision, every night of sleep for everyone who lived and worked in a building where death had become just another administrative function. And the walls were about to get thicker, higher, more elaborate, because Adelaide Gaol was about to expand again, driven by the simple mathematics of a growing colony, with a growing crime rate and a growing faith that architectural solutions could solve human problems that seemed resistant to every other form of intervention. The 1850s brought the first major architectural upgrade since the jail's original construction. Bluestone began replacing the earlier sandstone and brick construction, material that promised greater durability and more imposing presence. Bluestone quarries near Adelaide provided stone that was harder than sandstone, more weather-resistant than brick, and darker in color than either previous building material. The visual effect was immediate and intended. Where sandstone and brick suggested permanence, bluestone suggested inevitability. The darker color absorbed sunlight during the day and seemed to radiate cold during the night. The harder stone resisted weathering that softened other materials, maintaining sharp edges and clean joints that reminded observers that this building was built to last for generations. The first two-story block rose between 1857 and 1862. Vertical expansion within the constraints of Kingston's original radial design. The engineers had learned that when horizontal space was limited, vertical space offered solutions. More cells, more capacity, more efficient use of expensive urban land. The mathematics were persuasive. Double the height, double the capacity, without doubling the cost. But vertical expansion created problems that horizontal expansion would have avoided. Ventilation became more difficult when cells were stacked rather than spread. Sound traveled differently through multi-story buildings, carrying conversations and conflicts from floor to floor in ways that single-story construction had never allowed. And security became more complex when guards had to monitor prisoners above and below, as well as beside each other. The ventilation problems were immediate and serious. Air that might circulate adequately at ground level became stagnant when trapped between floors. The higher cells grew warm in summer and cold in winter, creating temperature variations that made some cells more punitive than others. Prisoners began to understand that cell assignment could determine not just their living conditions, but their survival prospects. Even contemporary observers noted the defective design and bad ventilation that resulted from vertical expansion. Inspector reports from the 1860s describe air quality so poor that guards complained of headaches after spending full shifts inside the building. The jail was becoming a machine that poisoned its own operators while processing its intended subjects. But the most revealing contemporary observation was that the jail had fallen behind the times, while remaining scrupulously clean. The building's physical hygiene had been maintained, but its functional design was becoming obsolete even as it expanded. Clean but dysfunctional, well-maintained but poorly planned, imposing but ineffective at its stated purpose of reforming criminals into productive citizens. The third-story addition came in the mid-1860s, pushed by prison population that continued to grow faster than reformative capacity. 3 stories of cells stacked like storage compartments, each floor connected by stone staircases that echoed with footsteps at all hours. The sound discipline that had been possible with single-story construction became impossible with multiple floors and interconnected staircases. The building's fix for every problem was always more mass. More cells when overcrowding became unmanageable. More floors when horizontal expansion reached the limits of the available land. More walls when security concerns demanded additional barriers. The solution to architectural failure was always more architecture, never different architecture. But mass creates its own problems. Weight that hadn't been anticipated in the original foundation design. Stress on load-bearing walls that had been calculated for single-story construction. Settlement patterns that created cracks in mortar joints and alignment problems in door frames. The building was slowly crushing itself under the weight of its own solutions. If air wouldn't circulate properly, rumor certainly would. And rumor, in a confined space with poor ventilation and deteriorating acoustics, traveled faster and farther than anyone had anticipated. Stories spread from cell to cell, floor to floor, building to building. Stories about what happened to prisoners who caused trouble. Stories about guards who could be bribed or intimidated. Stories about escape routes that might or might not exist. The most persistent rumors concerned the execution apparatus. Prisoners whispered about the portable gallows in the gangway, about the sounds that preceded death, about the possibility that any of them might be selected for that final administrative procedure. The rumors were usually inaccurate in detail but correct in their essential message. This building contained machinery for killing people, and that machinery could be activated at administrative discretion. Women's quarters evolved through the 1860s and 70s in ways that were designed to be invisible to casual observation. Additional cells carved into spaces that had never been intended for human habitation. Alterations disguised as maintenance, expansion disguised as repair. The women's section grew like a hidden infection, spreading through architectural margins that male planners had never considered. The female lunatics' quarters represented a particularly troubling innovation. Women whose crimes were attributed to mental illness rather than moral failure, but who still required containment because mental illness was considered nearly as dangerous as criminality. These women occupied cells that were simultaneously prison and asylum, punishment and treatment, containment and care. The classification system had become so complex that even guards sometimes couldn't remember which prisoners belonged in which categories. Debtors here, criminals there, lunatics somewhere else, women everywhere and nowhere. The building's capacity for classification had exceeded human capacity for keeping track of the classifications. The prison labor system expanded to match the building's growing capacity. Stonebreaking became a major industry, with prisoners quarrying rock from Dry Creek and shaping it for construction projects throughout Adelaide. The irony was deliberate: criminals forced to build the walls that would contain other criminals. Crime providing its own punishment through the labor required to build more punishment capacity. Unskilled hands turning quarried rock into walls meant to correct them. Prisoners learning masonry by building their own cages. The labor was both productive and punitive, contributing to colonial construction projects while teaching prisoners that their effort belonged to the state. Their skills served official purposes. Their time had value only when directed toward government-approved activities. The workshops multiplied and specialized: carpentry for furniture and construction, blacksmithing for hardware and tools, shoemaking for prison boots and colonial footwear, tailoring for uniforms and civilian clothing. Each workshop a small factory operated by unpaid labor under armed supervision, generating products that were sold to fund prison operations. But the most important product of prison labor wasn't shoes or furniture or hardware. It was the lesson that work could be compulsory, that skill could be commandeered, that human effort could be harvested for purposes the worker would never control. This lesson prepared prisoners for their eventual release into a colonial economy where wage labor often resembled prison labor except for the illusion of choice. Policy followed architecture, not the other way around. Segregation became possible only after space existed to make it practical. Programs were developed to fill buildings, not buildings developed to house programs. The blueprint controlled morals more effectively than legislation controlled behavior, because blueprints determined what was physically possible, while laws only determined what was theoretically prohibited. Classification categories multiplied as space became available to house them. First-time offenders separated from repeat criminals. Violent crimes separated from property crimes. Women separated from men. Children separated from adults. Mental illness separated from moral failure. Each separation requiring additional walls, additional guards, additional administrative complexity. But separation also created new opportunities for institutional control. Prisoners who cooperated could be rewarded with better classification, better cells, better work assignments. Prisoners who caused trouble could be punished with worse classification, worse cells. Isolation in spaces designed to break resistance through sensory deprivation and social disconnection. The jail was filling with categories that Kingston's original design had never imagined. His 1840 blueprint had assumed simple classification: criminals and non-criminals, men and women, guilty and innocent. But colonial crime had proved more complicated than colonial theory had anticipated. The building had to evolve to accommodate complexities that no architect could have foreseen. And evolution meant expansion. More rooms, more keys, more potential points of failure in a system that was becoming too complex for any single administrator to understand completely. Each new cell created new security requirements. Each new workshop created new opportunities for prisoner access to tools that could be used for escape or violence. Each new classification created new interfaces between different types of prisoners that had to be managed, monitored, controlled. The jail was becoming a small city devoted entirely to the processing of human failure. Streets that were corridors, neighborhoods that were cell blocks, businesses that were workshops operated by unpaid labor under armed supervision. A city where every resident was there involuntarily, every job was compulsory, every movement was monitored, and every decision was made by people who lived somewhere else. By the 1870s, Adelaide Gaol housed more than 300 prisoners in facilities designed for less than half that number. Overcrowding that made classification impossible, supervision inadequate, reform impractical. The building had become a warehouse for storing human problems that colonial society couldn't solve and didn't want to see. But warehouses don't solve problems. They just concentrate them. And concentrated problems, like concentrated chemicals, tend to become more volatile over time. Adelaide Gaol was about to learn that buildings designed to contain failure sometimes become failures themselves. That walls built to prevent escape sometimes create pressure that makes escape inevitable. The new building project began in 1878. A T-shaped structure that would add 92 cells plus additional solitary confinement capacity. Modern design, improved ventilation, up-to-date security features. Everything that the original jail lacked, built 90 feet away from everything the original jail had wrong. But the most significant feature of the new building wasn't the additional cells or the improved ventilation or the modern security systems. It was the permanent gallows that would be incorporated into A Wing, replacing the portable apparatus that had been erected and dismantled in the gangway for the previous 20 years. A permanent gallows meant permanent capability. No more temporary scaffolds that could be assembled and disassembled according to need. No more pretense that execution was an occasional administrative function. The jail was acknowledging what everyone already knew. Death was a regular part of its operations, and regular operations required permanent facilities. The new building represented the industrialization of punishment. More efficient housing, more efficient execution, more efficient processing of human beings who had failed to meet colonial standards for acceptable behavior. What had once been craftsmanship had become manufacturing. What had once been exceptional had become routine. And when you industrialize punishment, you invite an engineer's nightmare. Someone will study the system, identify its tolerances, and exploit its weaknesses. Adelaide Gaol was about to discover that efficiency creates vulnerabilities, that routine breeds complacency, and that the most secure systems sometimes fail in the most spectacular ways. The wall that surrounded the new building was, according to official reports, solidly built, of great height, and topped with loose bricks positioned to discourage climbing attempts, an old-school anti-climb tactic that turned the perimeter into a deliberate injury mechanism. Anyone attempting to scale the wall would dislodge bricks that would fall on their heads, creating noise that would alert guards and injuries that would incapacitate climbers. But loose bricks are a double-edged security feature. They prevent climbing, but they also provide projectiles. They create noise when disturbed, but they can also be deliberately disturbed to create distraction. They discourage escape attempts, but they can also be used as tools by prisoners creative enough to see opportunity in apparent obstacles. The new building's permanent gallows was installed in A Wing with the same attention to efficiency that characterized the rest of the structure. Modern scaffold design, tested mechanisms, reliable procedures. Death as a scheduled function in a building designed to schedule all human activities according to administrative convenience and official priorities. The gallows room was positioned to minimize disruption to the rest of the building's operations. Prisoners could be moved from condemned cell to execution chamber without passing through areas where other prisoners might see them. The procedure could be completed without interrupting workshops, meal service, exercise periods, or any other routine that kept the institution functioning smoothly. But efficiency, in prison design, often conflicts with security. Systems optimized for routine operations sometimes fail catastrophically when confronted with non-routine situations. Adelaide Gaol was about to learn this lesson through an incident that would expose every weakness in its carefully planned security arrangements. The date was June 24, 1867. The time was approximately 3 in the afternoon. The weather was clear, visibility excellent, guard coverage apparently adequate. 3 prisoners named John Balfe, John Oliver, and William Morehouse were about to demonstrate that the most secure prison is only as strong as its weakest moment of attention. These were not desperate men driven by sudden inspiration. They were planners, engineers of opportunity, students of institutional routine who had spent months observing guard schedules, testing door mechanisms, mapping sight lines, and identifying the precise intersection of security and negligence that would allow them to transform from prisoners into escapees. Balfe was serving time for robbery, Oliver for assault, Morehouse for theft. None of them facing death sentences, but all of them facing years inside walls that had been designed to break their spirits through architectural oppression. They had calculated that the risk of escape was less than the certainty of psychological destruction through long-term confinement in a building that treated human beings as administrative problems to be processed and stored. Their plan required tools, timing, and luck. The tools came from the prison workshop, where supervised access to carpentry equipment provided opportunities for creative borrowing. A 16-foot plank, ostensibly for legitimate construction work, could be repurposed as a ladder with sufficient leverage and desperation. Iron implements could be converted into prying devices for doors that had been designed to resist casual tampering, but not systematic assault. The timing required understanding guard schedules with scientific precision. When did shifts change? How long did it take guards to complete their rounds? What moments of transition created gaps in surveillance? Where did sight lines overlap? And where did they create blind spots? The prisoners had months to study these patterns, and they used that time like graduate students researching their dissertations. They also needed to neutralize a witness. Another prisoner who had observed their preparations and might alert guards before the plan could be executed. Their solution revealed the jail's social fabric could be weaponized as easily as wood or iron. The witness was bundled into the same cell and gagged, transforming a potential threat into an involuntary accomplice. Prison architecture that was designed to prevent cooperation sometimes forced cooperation in directions administrators hadn't anticipated. The escape began in broad daylight, during afternoon hours when guards were supposed to be most alert and prisoners most closely supervised. But supposed to be, and actually were, lived in different buildings, and the escapees had learned the difference through careful observation and patient planning. They used their 16-foot plank to bridge the gap between cell block and guard tower, creating an improvised walkway that bypassed several security features simultaneously. The plank was long enough to span the distance, but flexible enough to bend under weight, requiring physical coordination and psychological courage that most prisoners couldn't have managed even with identical tools and opportunities. The route led them into the gangway between inner and outer walls, the same space where portable gallows had been erected for private executions. The space that was supposed to be a security buffer became an escape corridor, proof that architectural solutions sometimes create the problems they were designed to solve. But the most shocking discovery came when they reached the guard tower. The position that was supposed to provide surveillance over the entire complex was unmanned. The guard who should have been watching for exactly this kind of activity was somewhere else, doing something else, leaving the institution's central nervous system temporarily blinded. They threw hook and rope onto the tower's barred window, climbed the wall, and went over the top. Freedom achieved through a blind spot in a structure that had been built to eliminate blind spots. The escape succeeded not because the security was weak, but because human attention had failed at precisely the moment when architectural security most needed human backup. Officials discovered the escape at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, nearly an hour after the men had cleared the walls. An hour head start in a manhunt was like a year. Head start in a foot race. By the time alarm was raised, telegrams sent, and search parties organized, the escapees had vanished into the Australian landscape like water into sand. The hunt moved from stone corridors to open country, from institutional control to police logistics, from contained problem to public crisis. 3 men who had been safely locked away were now armed and dangerous somewhere in the colonial countryside, and every farmer, shopkeeper, and traveler between Adelaide and the Murray River was suddenly part of an unwilling experiment in public safety. The escapees proved resourceful and bold. They broke into a house in Springton, 40 miles from Adelaide, stealing food and a shotgun. The theft transformed their escape from institutional embarrassment into public menace. Armed ex-prisoners roaming the countryside generated newspaper headlines, police mobilization, and public fear that spread faster than the search parties could cover ground. But fear, like architectural security, sometimes relies more on perception than reality. When the escapees were finally captured at a campfire near the Murray River, police discovered that their shotgun was unloaded. No ammunition had been found during the house break-in. The weapon that had generated public terror and police urgency was nothing more than an expensive club. dangerous only because everyone assumed it was loaded. The psychology of fear had done the heavy lifting. 3 men with an empty gun had terrified a countryside because the countryside didn't know the gun was empty. Reputation had expanded the search radius faster than horses could travel, proving that sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones that exist mainly in other people's imagination. But capture was not conclusion. It was merely the beginning of the next chapter in a story that would teach South Australia the difference between containing bodies and containing ideas. The 3 escapees were lodged in Blanchetown Lockup, a temporary holding facility on the Murray River that had been built to handle overnight detention, not to secure men who had already proved their expertise at defeating institutional security. Blanchetown was not Adelaide Gaol. It lacked the stone walls, the multiple barriers, the redundant security systems that had taken 27 years to develop and refine. What Blanchetown had was confidence, the assumption that captured escapees would be too exhausted and demoralized to attempt another break so soon after their recapture. But confidence is not architecture and assumptions are not security. 1 hour. That's how long the 3 men remained in Blanchetown custody before proving that some lessons can only be learned through repetition. 1 hour after their capture, 3 figures sprinted past a bedroom window, disappearing into the darkness beyond the township's few scattered lights. The lockup that was supposed to hold them until transport could be arranged to return them to Adelaide had become just another stepping stone in their campaign against institutional authority. The method was brutally simple, but devastatingly effective. They had dug through 2 feet of soft material using nothing more sophisticated than a water bucket handle, 2 feet of wall that looked solid from the outside but crumbled under patient, systematic assault from within. The hole they created was large enough for grown men to pass through, obvious enough that investigators would find it immediately, and damning enough to prove that Blanchetown's security was theatrical rather than functional. The escape triggered a response that revealed the true scope of colonial surveillance and control systems. Telegraphs fired down the river line, carrying descriptions and warnings to every settlement between the Murray mouth and the South Australian border. Mounted constables assembled from multiple districts, their horses fresh and their orders clear. Find the escapees before they could disappear into the vast interior where colonial authority thinned to invisibility. But the most revealing element of the manhunt was the inclusion of Aboriginal tracker Jim Morris, whose skills represented a technology that colonial systems couldn't replicate or replace. Morris could read landscape like others read newspapers, following traces that were invisible to European eyes, understanding movement patterns that made sense only to someone who had learned to survive in country that killed the unprepared. The tracker's involvement illustrated the limits of architectural security. Stone walls and iron bars could contain bodies, but they couldn't prevent escape. Once prisoners cleared the perimeter, institutional control gave way to older forms of knowledge, indigenous expertise, skills that predated colonial settlement and would outlast colonial buildings. The jail's power stopped at its walls, and beyond those walls, other forms of authority took precedence. The search revealed patterns that would become familiar in Australian criminal history. Escapees heading for river systems that provided water and transportation, small settlements offering opportunities for supply and shelter, isolated homesteads vulnerable to break-ins by desperate men who had nothing left to lose. The landscape itself becoming a co-conspirator in crimes that began behind prison walls but extended across hundreds of miles of territory that no government could effectively patrol. Oliver was caught by fishermen using a shotgun that also wasn't loaded. Twice in one story, empty weapons controlled men who didn't know they were empty. Fear had become the most reliable tool in both criminal and law enforcement arsenals, more effective than ammunition because it required no reload time, no careful aim, no physical contact. The threat was enough. The possibility was sufficient. Terror filled in the gaps that actual violence couldn't reach. But the deeper story wasn't about individual escape attempts, or police procedures, or the psychology of fear. It was about the fundamental impossibility of perfect security in an imperfect world. Every wall could be climbed, every lock could be picked, every guard could be distracted or bribed or overwhelmed. Security was always temporary, always conditional, always dependent on variables that couldn't be completely controlled. Back in Adelaide, officials faced questions that cut deeper than operational failure. How many other weak points were hiding in plain sight? How many other guards were absent from posts they were supposed to be monitoring? How many other assumptions about institutional security were based on hope rather than tested reality? The investigation that followed the escape revealed systemic problems that went far beyond the immediate circumstances of June 24th. Guard schedules that created predictable gaps in surveillance, key management systems that allowed too many people access to too many doors, communication protocols that depended on individual initiative rather than institutional procedure. The escape had exposed not just a moment of failure, but a pattern of vulnerabilities that threatened the entire premise of institutional security. The sentences imposed on the 3 escapees were designed to restore institutional authority through the application of spectacular brutality. Leg irons that would remain locked for months, making walking difficult and running impossible. Solitary confinement in cells designed to break psychological resistance through sensory deprivation and social isolation. Hard labor assignments that would exhaust the body while occupying the mind with repetitive tasks that served no purpose except punishment. But the most telling detail was what prosecutors chose not to do. Charges related to the jail break itself were eventually dropped, with officials claiming that the other punishments represented sufficient punishment. The legal system's reluctance to prosecute the escape suggested a recognition that the incident had revealed institutional failures that officials preferred not to examine too closely in open court. The architectural response was immediate and revealing. Steel mesh was installed across guard tower windows so that rope and hook couldn't latch again. Design patched by retrofitting shame, security improved through the application of lessons learned at the cost of institutional humiliation. The mesh would prevent future hook and rope escapes, but it also served as permanent reminder that the building's security had failed in the most spectacular possible way. But the most haunting artifact of the escape remained in the yard until the jail's closure in 1988. The 16-foot plank used in the escape was never removed, never destroyed, never explained. It simply remained like a curse nobody dared to name, a piece of evidence gathering weather and age while serving as daily reminder that institutional authority was always temporary, always vulnerable, always dependent on the cooperation of people who had every reason to refuse that cooperation. The plank's persistence suggested something deeper than administrative oversight. It hinted at institutional paralysis, the inability to acknowledge failure by removing evidence of failure, the preference for living with uncomfortable reminders rather than confronting uncomfortable truths. For 21 years, guards and prisoners walked past that plank, knowing what it represented, understanding what it proved about the limits of architectural control. But the escape's most lasting impact wasn't on security procedures or architectural features. It was on the institution's relationship with its own mythology. Adelaide Gaol had been built on the premise that proper design could eliminate escape possibilities, that sufficient walls and adequate supervision could create perfect security. The escape of June 24th proved that premise false, not through theoretical argument, but through practical demonstration. The jail had sealed its tower windows, but it couldn't seal the knowledge that windows could be reached, towers could be climbed, walls could be crossed. That knowledge would spread through the prisoner population like infection, generating escape attempts that might fail but would never stop. Every prisoner now knew that escape was possible, that the building's security was human rather than absolute, that institutional power depended on attention and cooperation rather than stone and iron. But the institution's most serious crisis was yet to come. The state's relationship with killing was about to change in ways that would transform Adelaide Gaol from a machine for punishment into a machine for death, from a place where some people were reformed and others were contained into a place where certain categories of people were systematically eliminated according to procedures that would make execution as routine as laundry or meal service. The hanging statistics tell a story that numbers can't fully capture. Over the decades that followed, 45 of South Australia's 66 hangings would occur within Adelaide Gaol's walls. 68% of the colony's official killings concentrated in one building, making that building the colony's primary death factory, its most reliable mechanism for converting judicial decisions into corpses. The evolution of execution locations within the jail revealed administrative thinking about the relationship between death and publicity. Early hangings occurred outside the front gates, where thousands of spectators could witness the state's ultimate assertion of authority. Later executions moved to the lane area between buildings, reducing crowds while maintaining some degree of public access. Then came the gangway executions, completely private, but still using portable apparatus that had to be assembled for each procedure. But the most significant change was yet to come: the conversion of one obsolete lookout tower into a permanent execution chamber, a room devoted exclusively to the business of ending human lives, according to legal procedures that had been refined through decades of practice. The jail was about to acquire a space that existed for no purpose except death, a room that would process the colony's most unwanted criminals through the most final procedure available. The decision to convert the tower revealed the colonial government's evolving attitude toward capital punishment. What had once been exceptional was becoming routine. What had once required special arrangements was becoming institutionalized. Death was no longer an occasional administrative function that required temporary solutions. It was a regular part of the jail's operations that deserved permanent facilities designed specifically for that purpose. The tower conversion began in 1950, nearly 80 years after the building's original construction, more than a century after South Australia's first public execution. The choice of tower made practical sense. Views from the tower were obsoleted by more modern surveillance technology. The space was isolated from the rest of the building's operations, and the height provided acoustic isolation that would muffle sounds that might disturb other prisoners or alert outside observers. But the choice also made symbolic sense. Towers had traditionally been associated with watching, with surveillance, with the state's ability to see everything that happened within its domain. Converting a watchtower into a death chamber transformed observation into elimination, surveillance into finality. The same architectural feature that had once protected the institution would now serve to eliminate individuals who threatened the institution's authority. The hanging tower, as it came to be known, represented the complete industrialization of capital punishment. Modern scaffold design incorporating lessons learned from decades of execution experience. Reliable mechanisms that would function predictably under the stress of official killing. Procedures refined through repetition until death became as routine as any other administrative function. The first to die in the new facility was John Balaban in 1953. Modern scaffold inside medieval stone, new technology serving ancient purposes, efficiency applied to the oldest form of official violence. Balaban's execution inaugurated not just a new execution chamber, but a new era in the relationship between state and citizen, law and death, justice and elimination. The tower's reputation became more effective than its locks. Prisoners throughout the jail understood that the building now contained machinery specifically designed for killing them if circumstances demanded. Not just the theoretical possibility of execution that had always existed, but physical infrastructure devoted exclusively to that purpose. A room that existed for no other reason than to provide a suitable environment for ending human lives according to legal procedures. But reputations in prisons can become more powerful than physical barriers. The knowledge that the building contained a death chamber influenced behavior throughout the institution. Guards worked with the understanding that their workplace included a room devoted to killing. Prisoners lived with the knowledge that their temporary home contained machinery that might be used to end their lives. Administrators made decisions knowing that their building could process human beings all the way to death if other forms of processing proved inadequate. The tower had acquired a new identity, and that identity would shape the jail's character for the remaining years of its operation. Not just a place where criminals were held and reformed and released, but a place where some criminals were eliminated through procedures that had become as institutionalized as meal service or medical care. Death as a regularly scheduled administrative function in a building designed to schedule all aspects of human existence according to official convenience and state priorities. 24 November 1964. Glensaber Vallance walked from his cell to the hanging tower, becoming South Australia's last execution, the final demonstration of the colony's faith in death as a tool of social control. His death marked not just the end of a man's life, but the end of an era in which colonial governments believed that killing citizens would make other citizens more law-abiding. The date would be painted into the site's memory, like graffiti that couldn't be erased. 24 November 1964. The last time the machinery functioned as designed. The last time the hanging tower served its intended purpose. The last time South Australia proved its authority through the deliberate ending of a human life according to legal procedures that had been refined through more than a century of practice. After Vallance died, the machinery remained, but the ritual stopped. Like a factory that couldn't forget what it used to build, the jail contained all the infrastructure necessary for execution, but lacked the political will to use it. The hanging tower stood empty, its scaffold ready, its procedures documented, its capacity intact, but its purpose abandoned. The cessation of executions created a different kind of institutional crisis. What becomes of a prison whose identity has been built around endings? How does a building adapt when its most final function is suddenly removed from its operational repertoire? The jail had been designed to process people through various stages of punishment, with death as the ultimate stage for those who couldn't be reformed through lesser measures. Without that ultimate sanction, the entire system had to reconceptualize its purpose and methods. But the building's infrastructure told a different story than its policies. The hanging tower remained, scaffold intact, procedures documented, capacity preserved, like a museum exhibit that nobody wanted to visit. The room that had been designed for death continued to exist, continued to cast its shadow over the rest of the institution, continued to remind everyone who worked or lived there that the machinery of killing was still present, still functional, still available, if political winds changed direction. The psychological impact of maintaining death infrastructure without using it created unique institutional stress. Guards worked in a building that contained a room devoted to ending human lives, but they were forbidden to acknowledge that room's purpose or discuss its capabilities. Prisoners lived with the knowledge that their temporary home contained machinery designed to kill them, but they weren't supposed to think about that machinery or worry about its possible activation. The silence surrounding the hanging tower became more oppressive than its operation had been. When executions occurred regularly, everyone understood the building's purpose and their role within that purpose. When executions stopped, but the infrastructure remained, the building's identity became ambiguous, uncertain, haunted by capabilities that existed but couldn't be acknowledged. Administrative documents from the 1970s reveal the institutional confusion that followed the end of executions. Classification manuals that still included procedures for condemned prisoners. Security protocols that maintained special handling requirements for capital cases. Training materials that taught guards how to manage execution procedures that they would never be allowed to implement. The jail had become a machine with parts that no longer functioned but couldn't be removed. Like a clock with hands that had stopped but gears that continued to turn. The institution maintained operational capacity for functions that were no longer socially or politically acceptable. The building remembered what it had been designed to do, even when the society that built it had forgotten why it had seemed like a good idea. But the most profound change wasn't in the building's operational capacity. It was in the relationship between modern penal theory and 19th century architecture. By the 1970s, criminal justice philosophy emphasized rehabilitation over punishment, integration over isolation, therapeutic intervention over physical deterrence. But Adelaide Gaol had been built according to principles that emphasized moral correction through architectural oppression, social control through spatial manipulation, reform through systematic degradation of human dignity. The collision between progressive criminal justice policy and regressive criminal justice architecture created daily contradictions that made effective prison management nearly impossible. Programs designed to prepare prisoners for successful reintegration into society had to be conducted in spaces designed to break prisoners' connection to society. Therapeutic interventions aimed at addressing the causes of criminal behavior had to compete with architectural features designed to punish criminal behavior through environmental stress. Remand procedures changed throughout the 1970s, reflecting evolving legal protections for accused persons and growing recognition that pretrial detention should be minimally restrictive. But Adelaide Gaol's remand facilities had been designed according to 19th-century assumptions that accused persons were probably guilty and should be housed accordingly. Modern legal standards collided daily with historical architectural realities. The building's integrity became its operational curse. Externally intact, internally obsolete, the jail dictated conditions because redesign would mean admitting that the entire experiment had been flawed from the beginning. Easier to work around architectural limitations than acknowledge architectural failures. Easier to adapt modern procedures to historical spaces than rebuild historical spaces for modern procedures. Sections of the jail were vacated as new facilities opened throughout South Australia. Modern prisons designed according to contemporary understanding of human psychology, criminal behavior, and rehabilitation theory. Facilities that prioritized natural light over surveillance capability, social interaction over isolation, skill development over punishment labor. Everything that Adelaide Gaol was not and could never become without complete reconstruction. But vacating sections created its own problems. Empty cell blocks became security vulnerabilities, requiring maintenance without generating revenue. Unused workshops collected dust, while guards continued to patrol corridors that served no current purpose. The building was slowly consuming itself, requiring resources to maintain capacity that was no longer needed or wanted. The jail's classification systems, once the pride of progressive penology, had become liability in an era of legal challenges to discriminatory practices. Separate facilities for different categories of prisoners created separate standards of treatment that courts increasingly viewed as unequal justice. The architectural features that had once demonstrated South Australia's commitment to scientific criminology now demonstrated South Australia's resistance to constitutional requirements for equal treatment under law. Women's facilities posed particular challenges as legal standards evolved to require gender equality in correctional services. The jail's women's quarters had been architectural afterthoughts from the beginning, carved into spaces that hadn't been designed for human habitation, much less for programs aimed at successful reintegration into society. Providing equal programming in unequal spaces proved impossible without massive reconstruction that the state couldn't afford and wouldn't approve. The children's sections represented the jail's most troubling legacy. Throughout its operational history, Adelaide Gaol had housed men, women, and children in facilities that made no meaningful distinction between juvenile and adult offenders beyond spatial separation that was often nominal. By the 1970s, juvenile justice theory emphasized education, family preservation, and community-based alternatives to incarceration. But Adelaide Gaol's juvenile facilities had been designed to punish children according to principles that treated childhood crime as evidence of moral corruption, requiring architectural correction. Each category of prisoner represented a scar in the building's operational history. Each classification system revealed the assumptions that had guided colonial criminal justice policy. Each architectural feature demonstrated the degree to which 19th-century society had believed that human behavior could be modified through spatial manipulation and environmental control. But the building's most persistent challenge wasn't operational or philosophical. It was economic. Adelaide Gaol had become expensive to maintain relative to its functional capacity. Heating systems designed for 19th-century winters required constant repair. Plumbing systems installed decades before modern sanitation standards demanded continuous upgrade. Security systems based on physical barriers rather than electronic monitoring required higher staffing levels than modern facilities. The mathematics of incarceration had shifted against institutions like Adelaide Gaol. Modern prisons could house more prisoners more safely, with fewer guards using contemporary design principles and current technology. The jail's stone walls and iron bars, once symbols of permanence and authority, had become symbols of inefficiency and obsolescence. Maintenance costs escalated as the building aged and standards evolved: lead paint removal, asbestos abatement, electrical system upgrades to meet current safety codes, structural reinforcement for buildings that hadn't been designed to carry the weight of multiple additions and modifications. Each upgrade revealed additional problems that required additional investment in a facility that was becoming economically indefensible. But the most expensive maintenance was psychological. Staff turnover increased as correctional officers sought positions in modern facilities that didn't require them to work in buildings haunted by more than a century of institutional violence. Recruitment became difficult as qualified candidates chose employment opportunities that didn't involve daily exposure to architectural environments designed to degrade human dignity. The building's reputation had become a liability in ways that went beyond operational efficiency. Adelaide Gaol was known throughout the criminal justice system as a place where careers stagnated and morale deteriorated. Guards who worked there too long developed institutional cynicism that made them unsuitable for employment in rehabilitation-oriented facilities. Administrators who managed the jail found their experience difficult to transfer to modern correctional environments. Training programs had to account for the specific psychological stresses of working in a building where death had been a regular administrative function. New employees required orientation not just to current procedures, but to historical practices that continued to influence the institution's culture. Veterans needed counseling to address the cumulative psychological impact of working in environments designed to break human spirits. But the jail's problems went deeper than staff management or operational efficiency. The building had become a symbol of approaches to criminal justice that South Australian society was trying to leave behind: punishment-oriented rather than rehabilitation-focused, authoritarian rather than therapeutic, designed to satisfy public appetite for retribution rather than public interest in successful reintegration of offenders into productive citizenship. Political pressure mounted throughout the 1970s and 80s for closure of institutions that represented obsolete approaches to criminal justice. Adelaide Gaol became a target for reformers who argued that the building's architecture made progressive programming impossible, and that the state's commitment to modern criminal justice principles required modern criminal justice facilities. The end, when it came, arrived not through dramatic failure or public scandal, but through bureaucratic transfer order, quiet administrative decision that reflected changing priorities and budget constraints rather than moral awakening or philosophical transformation. Adelaide Gaol would close not because society had recognized the cruelty of its methods, but because those methods had become expensive and inefficient relative to available alternatives. 1888. The date marked on transfer orders and administrative directives, the end of the longest-running prison story in Australian history. 147 years of operation, from colonial experiment to historical artifact, from solution to problem, from symbol of progress to symbol of everything that progressive criminal justice sought to leave behind. But closure raised questions that operation had never confronted. What happens to a building designed for institutional violence when institutional violence is no longer politically acceptable? How does a structure built to break human spirits find new purpose in a society that claims to value human dignity? Can architecture that was designed to degrade be transformed into architecture that serves humane purposes? The answers would emerge slowly, through the complex process of converting operational space into historical space, living institution into preserved artifact, working prison into educational museum. But transformation couldn't erase memory. The building would carry its history forward into whatever came next, like scars that fade but never disappear completely. Decommissioning revealed the true scope of what Adelaide Gaol had become during its century and a half of operation. Keys inventoried by the thousands, each one controlling access to spaces where human lives had been controlled, directed, and sometimes ended according to procedures that had seemed reasonable to the people who had designed them. Wing after wing cleared of the human presence that had given them purpose, leaving only empty cells and echoing corridors, and the residual energy of concentrated human misery. The routines that had structured life inside the walls for generations erased in weeks. No more morning bells to wake prisoners at 6. No more evening lights out at 8. No more work details marching to workshops where unpaid labor had generated products sold to fund the system that enslaved the laborers. No more meal lines, exercise periods, classification interviews, disciplinary hearings. No more of the 1,000 daily procedures that had transformed chaotic human behavior into regulated institutional routine. But erasing routines couldn't erase the spaces where those routines had been performed. The cells remained, their dimensions unchanged, their capacity for psychological pressure intact. The workshops remained, their tools removed but their purpose still visible in the arrangement of workbenches and the positioning of guard stations. The hanging tower remained, its scaffold dismantled but its acoustics still perfect for muffling the sounds of official death. The silence that followed closure was different from the silence that had characterized operation. During operational years, silence had been imposed through architectural design and administrative discipline. Prisoners learned to be quiet because noise attracted attention that usually resulted in punishment. Guards learned to work quietly because efficiency required minimal disturbance of institutional routine. But post-closure silence was natural, environmental, the product of removing human presence from spaces designed to control human presence. This silence revealed architectural features that had been masked by operational noise. The way stone walls absorbed sound, the way iron doors amplified echoes, the way empty spaces created acoustic environments that seemed designed to make individual voices sound small and insignificant. The building's conversion from operational facility to historical site required careful negotiation between preservation and safety, between historical accuracy and public accessibility. Visitors would need to see authentic spaces without being exposed to conditions that had been psychologically destructive to the people who had lived in those spaces. The challenge was presenting honest history without recreating harmful environments. Tours would follow routes that had been forbidden to most prisoners during operational years. Visitors could walk freely through spaces where movement had been controlled, regulated, limited by administrative necessity and security requirements. The irony was deliberate. Freedom to explore a building that had been designed to eliminate freedom. Tourism in spaces that had been specifically intended to be uninviting. But the most significant transformation was psychological rather than physical. Adelaide Gaol flipped overnight from operational facility to historical artifact, from feared institution to preserved curiosity, from active threat to safe memory. The public that had once avoided approaching the building now paid admission fees to enter spaces they had spent generations trying to avoid. The conversion revealed how much of the building's power had depended on function rather than form. Cells that had been terrifying when occupied by prisoners became merely historical curiosities when empty. Workshops that had been oppressive when filled with unpaid laborers became interesting examples of historical industrial techniques when devoid of human suffering. Even the hanging tower, once the building's most feared space, became educational opportunity when its scaffold was removed and its purpose relegated to museum interpretation. But interpretation couldn't avoid the central questions that the building's history raised. How had civilized society convinced itself that caging human beings in 8-foot by 4-foot cells would make those human beings more civilized? How had democratic government justified killing citizens to teach other citizens respect for human life? How had progressive colony built institutions based on systematic degradation of human dignity? The answers lay partially in the building itself, in architectural features that had been designed to make brutality seem necessary. Degradation seemed therapeutic, violence seemed civilized, stone walls that made punishment seem permanent, iron bars that made control seem absolute, surveillance towers that made observation seem scientific. The building had been designed to justify its own existence through environmental arguments that seemed compelling to people who never had to live inside the environment they were creating. But the deeper answers lay in the social and economic pressures that had created demand for institutions like Adelaide Gaol in the first place. Colonial society that was too new to develop alternatives to punishment, too poor to fund rehabilitation programs, too insecure to risk experiments with restorative justice. Fear had driven architectural choices, and architectural choices had reinforced fear, creating feedback loops that had made humane alternatives seem impractical or dangerous. The jail's preserved spaces would become laboratories for examining these historical processes, classrooms for understanding how democratic societies could develop institutions that contradicted democratic values. Visitors could walk through cells and workshops and execution chambers while considering the political and economic pressures that had made such spaces seem necessary to the people who had designed, funded, and operated them. But preservation also raised ethical questions about the relationship between memory and entertainment. Should spaces where human suffering had been systematically organized be converted into recreational destinations? Could tourism serve historical education without trivializing historical trauma? How should society remember institutions it had created and later rejected? The jail's evolution from prison to museum would force these questions into public conversation in ways that academic discussion never could. Visitors walking through authentic cells would confront physical evidence of their society's capacity for institutional cruelty. They would stand in spaces where human beings had been deliberately broken and consider their own relationship to systems of power that continued to operate in different forms. But the building's most persistent influence might be atmospheric rather than educational. Adelaide Gaol had accumulated more than a century of human pain, fear, desperation, and death within walls that had been designed to contain and concentrate such emotions. That energy couldn't be erased through administrative procedures or neutralized through historical interpretation. The reports began almost immediately after closure. Sightings, sounds, experiences that couldn't be explained through conventional understanding of how empty buildings behave. Guards who had worked in the building during its operational years reported phenomena they had never experienced while the jail was occupied by living prisoners. Tourists described encounters with presences that felt human but couldn't be seen. Whether these reports reflected supernatural activity or psychological response to historically traumatic space, they served similar function. They ensured that Adelaide Gaol's history remained present rather than past, immediate rather than academic, visceral rather than theoretical. The building wouldn't allow its history to be safely relegated to textbooks and guided tours. The ghost reports transformed Adelaide Gaol into one of Australia's most famous haunted locations, drawing visitors who came seeking paranormal experience rather than historical education. But supernatural tourism served historical purposes, whether it intended to or not. Visitors attracted by ghost stories encountered authentic historical spaces and learned, almost by accident, about institutional practices that their society had once considered normal and necessary. The jail had found new life as repository of fear, but fear of a different kind than it had originally been designed to generate. Instead of fear of legal consequences for criminal behavior, it now generated fear of historical consequences of institutional behavior. Instead of teaching individuals to respect legal authority, it taught society to question institutional authority. Instead of reinforcing existing power structures, it encouraged examination of how power structures had developed and how they might be reformed. But the building's ultimate legacy remained ambiguous. Preserved as warning against institutional excess or celebrated as example of historical progress. Remember as symbol of social failure or honored as evidence of social evolution. The interpretation would depend on visitors, educators, political leaders, and cultural movements that would use Adelaide Gaol spaces to address contemporary questions about justice, punishment, human dignity, and the proper relationship between individual freedom and social order. And in the preserved silence of empty cells and workshops and execution chambers, the building waited to see what lessons future generations would draw from the evidence it contained. Stone and iron that had once confined bodies now confined memory. But memory proved harder to control than bodies had been. The jail's history would continue to influence conversations about justice and humanity long after its last prisoner had been transferred and its final guard had locked the gates for the last time. The numbers tell a story that transcends individual tragedy and enters the realm of systematic industrial processing. 45 of South Australia's 66 hangings occurred within Adelaide Gaol's walls. 68% of the colony's official killings concentrated in one building, transforming that building into something unprecedented in Australian history, a factory for the production of judicial death. The distribution of executions across different locations within the jail reveals the evolution of state attitudes toward the relationship between death and publicity. The front gate executions drew thousands of spectators, transforming individual punishment into community theater. The lane area executions reduced crowds while maintaining symbolic accessibility. The gangway executions eliminated public witness while preserving official procedure. Each relocation reflected changing beliefs about whether state killing should be educational spectacle or administrative routine. But it was the portable gallows system that revealed the true industrialization of capital punishment. Scaffold components manufactured to precise specifications, tested for reliability under stress, designed for rapid assembly and efficient operation. The apparatus could be erected in any suitable space within the jail, transforming ordinary architectural features into execution chambers according to administrative convenience and scheduling requirements. The logistics were refined through repetition, guards trained to position equipment according to documented procedures, chaplains prepared to deliver final blessings within time constraints that accommodated institutional schedules, medical personnel standing by to certify death according to legal requirements that demanded official witness to official killing. Each execution became a demonstration of bureaucratic competence applied to the ultimate bureaucratic function, ending human life according to proper procedures. The portable gallows traveled beyond Adelaide Gaol's walls, shipped by rail to locations throughout South Australia where local facilities lacked permanent execution capability. By 1900, the apparatus had become surplus machinery, exported like any other government equipment that had outlived its usefulness at the point of manufacture. The colony's execution technology distributed across the continent, proof that killing had become a standardized governmental function that could be replicated anywhere that legal authority existed. But the most terrifying aspect of Adelaide Gaol's execution program was not its efficiency or its technological sophistication. It was its administrative normalcy. Death became a scheduled procedure with designated architecture, documented protocols, trained personnel, and quality control measures. Killing was absorbed into the routine operations of government like any other regulatory function that required specialized knowledge and appropriate facilities. The execution logbooks read like shipping manifests: names, dates, times, procedures followed, results achieved. Each entry a bureaucratic acknowledgement that another human life had been processed through the system and removed from circulation. The language was clinical, administrative, deliberately drained of emotional content that might interfere with operational efficiency or moral certainty. Contemporary observers noted the strange atmosphere that executions created within the broader jail community. Heightened security during the days preceding scheduled deaths. Unusual silence among prisoners who understood that their temporary home was about to demonstrate its ultimate capability. Guards working with the knowledge that their routine duties would soon include witness to deliberate killing performed according to procedures they had been trained to support. But the deepest impact was on the building itself. Adelaide Gaol accumulated the psychic weight of systematic killing across decades of operation. Stone walls absorbed more than sound. They absorbed the energy of fear, desperation, and final moments repeated until they became institutional memory, embedded in the architecture itself. The building learned to kill, and learning changed its essential character from containment facility to elimination facility. The transition from portable to permanent execution apparatus marked a crucial evolution in institutional thinking. When South Australia decided to convert one obsolete lookout tower into dedicated execution space, it acknowledged that death had become a core function rather than an occasional necessity. The tower conversion represented the ultimate architectural admission. This building exists not just to hold people but to kill them when holding them proves insufficient. The choice of tower location was both practical and symbolic. Practical because towers provided height that enhanced acoustic isolation. separating sounds of execution from the rest of the institutional soundscape. Symbolic because towers had traditionally represented surveillance and control, watching and waiting. Converting a watchtower into a death chamber transformed observation into elimination, vigilance into finality. The construction process required specialized knowledge that existed nowhere else in South Australian government. How do you build a room whose sole purpose is ending human lives? What materials provide optimal acoustic dampening for sounds that must not carry beyond the immediate vicinity? How do you design ventilation systems that will handle the specific atmospheric requirements of enclosed execution procedures? The answers came from international consultation, correspondence with execution specialists in other jurisdictions that had solved similar architectural problems. The hanging tower became a collaboration between local building skills and global expertise in institutional killing, proof that governments worldwide had developed sufficient experience with judicial death to constitute a professional knowledge base. The tower's completion in 1950 inaugurated a new era in South Australia's relationship with capital punishment. Modern execution chamber incorporating lessons learned from a century of hanging experience. Reliable mechanisms that would function predictably under the psychological stress of officially sanctioned killing. Procedures refined through systematic study of what worked and what didn't work when the goal was quick, clean, bureaucratically defensible death. John Balaban walked into the hanging tower on a clear morning in 1953, becoming the first to die in South Australia's newest and most efficient killing facility. His execution inaugurated not just updated death technology, but updated death philosophy. Killing was no longer an unfortunate necessity that required makeshift arrangements. It was a governmental capability that deserved permanent infrastructure designed specifically for that purpose. The tower's acoustic engineering proved exceptional. Prisoners in adjacent cell blocks reported hearing nothing during Balaban's execution. Guards stationed throughout the jail confirmed that operational noise from the killing procedure remained contained within the tower's stone walls. The room had successfully isolated the sounds of death from the sounds of life, creating acoustic separation that matched the moral separation between condemned and merely imprisoned. But acoustic isolation couldn't prevent psychological contamination. Everyone who lived or worked in Adelaide Gaol understood what the tower contained and what procedures occurred there according to administrative schedule. The building's identity had been permanently altered by the addition of space devoted exclusively to ending human lives. Workers and prisoners alike carried the knowledge that their daily environment included machinery specifically designed for killing people when other forms of processing proved inadequate. The tower's reputation became more effective than physical security measures. Prisoners throughout the jail understood that the building now possessed industrial-grade death capability that could be activated according to judicial decision and administrative convenience. The possibility of execution influenced behavior throughout the institution in ways that no other punishment could match. Death concentrates attention like nothing else available to governmental authority. Guards developed professional mechanisms for psychological protection against the stress of working in buildings that contained death chambers. Compartmentalization techniques that separated routine duties from execution duties, even though both occurred within the same architectural environment. Emotional distancing that allowed normal human beings to function professionally in abnormal human environments. But psychological protection came at psychological cost, creating institutional cultures that valued emotional numbness over emotional engagement. The hanging tower operated for 11 years, from 1953 to 1964. 4 executions during that period, each one a demonstration of South Australia's commitment to death as policy tool. Each execution proof that the tower functioned as designed, that permanent execution infrastructure could deliver reliable killing according to administrative requirement and legal mandate. But the tower's most historically significant execution was also its last. Glenn Sabre Valance died on November 24, 1964, becoming South Australia's final demonstration that governmental authority included the power to end citizen lives according to judicial procedures that had been refined through more than a century of practice. Valance's execution marked the end of an era that had begun with public hangings outside Adelaide Gaol's front gates. From spectacle to secrecy, from community education to administrative routine, from exceptional event to industrial process, the evolution of execution procedures paralleled the evolution of governmental power from local and personal to systematic and bureaucratic. The date November 24, 1964, would be painted into Adelaide Gaol's institutional memory like a gravestone inscription that couldn't be erased. The last time the machinery functioned as designed. The last time South Australia proved its authority through deliberate killing. The last time the hanging tower served its intended purpose as factory for the production of judicial death. But endings create their own problems. What happens to death infrastructure when death policies change? How does a building adapt when its most final function is suddenly removed from operational repertoire? Adelaide Gaol would spend the next 24 years learning to function as a prison whose most prison-like capability had been politically amputated. The hanging tower remained operational after Valence's execution, scaffold maintained in ready condition, procedures documented and available for implementation if political circumstances demanded resumption of execution policy. The room existed in institutional limbo, fully functional but politically unusable, technically ready but socially unacceptable. The maintenance of unused death capability created unique institutional stress. Guards cleaned and serviced equipment they hoped never to use again. Administrators maintained protocols for procedures they expected never to implement. Training materials continued to include execution procedures that new employees would never be required to perform. The jail had become a machine with parts that existed but couldn't function. Prisoners understood the tower's continued existence and operational readiness. Conversations in cells and workshops and exercise yards included speculation about whether execution policies might change, whether the machinery might be reactivated, whether the state's temporary squeamishness about killing might prove temporary indeed. The possibility of resumed executions influenced institutional culture, even when execution never occurred. But the deeper change was in South Australia's relationship with governmental killing. The cessation of executions reflected evolving social attitudes toward the proper limits of state power, growing discomfort with governmental authority that extended to ending citizen lives. Capital punishment had become politically problematic in ways that made its continuation more difficult than its abandonment. The jail entered its final decades as an institution whose identity had been shaped by capabilities it no longer possessed. Built to kill, designed to eliminate, engineered to provide permanent solutions to persistent criminal problems, but operated in a political environment that had removed death from the acceptable range of governmental responses to individual criminality. By the 1970s, Adelaide Gaol had become a historical artifact that continued to function as a contemporary institution. Modern penal policies implemented in 19th-century architectural environment. Rehabilitation programs conducted in spaces designed for punishment. Therapeutic interventions attempted in buildings that had been specifically engineered to resist therapeutic outcomes. The collision between progressive criminal justice theory and regressive criminal justice architecture created daily operational impossibilities. Caseworkers trying to prepare prisoners for successful community reintegration in cells designed to break community connections. Educational programs competing with environmental messages that human dignity was conditional and revocable. Counseling services offered in buildings that had been designed to demonstrate the futility of human resistance to governmental authority. Sections of the jail were gradually vacated as modern facilities opened throughout South Australia. New prisons designed according to contemporary understanding of human psychology, criminal behavior, and rehabilitation potential. Facilities that prioritized natural light over surveillance capability, social interaction over isolation, skill development over punishment labor, therapeutic intervention over environmental oppression. But vacating sections of Adelaide Gaol created security vulnerabilities and maintenance problems. Empty cell blocks required ongoing patrol and upkeep while generating no operational benefit. Unused workshops collected dust and deteriorated, while guards continued monitoring spaces that served no current purpose. The building was slowly consuming itself, requiring resources to maintain capacity that was no longer needed, wanted, or justifiable according to contemporary correctional standards. The jail's classification systems had become legal liabilities in an era of constitutional challenges to discriminatory treatment. Separate facilities for different prisoner categories created separate standards of care that courts increasingly viewed as violations of equal protection principles. Architectural features that had once demonstrated progressive penological thinking now demonstrated institutional resistance to constitutional requirements for equal justice. Women's facilities posed particular challenges as legal standards evolved to require gender equality in correctional programming and services. Adelaide Gaol's women's quarters had been architectural afterthoughts from the beginning, spaces carved from areas that hadn't been designed for human habitation, much less for programs aimed at successful reintegration into society. Providing constitutionally adequate programming in constitutionally inadequate spaces proved impossible without reconstruction that the state couldn't afford and wouldn't authorize. Children's facilities represented the institution's most troubling legacy. Throughout its operational history, Adelaide Gaol had confined men, women, and children. According to classification systems that treated juvenile offenders as small criminals rather than developing citizens requiring specialized intervention. By the 1970s, juvenile justice theory emphasized education, family preservation, and community-based alternatives to institutional confinement. But Adelaide Gaol's juvenile facilities had been designed to punish children, according to principles that viewed childhood crime as evidence of moral corruption requiring architectural correction. The jail's continued operation became increasingly difficult to justify according to any contemporary standard of correctional effectiveness, fiscal responsibility, or constitutional compliance. Expensive to maintain, impossible to modernize, resistant to reform programming, the institution had become a historical artifact that happened to contain living human beings who deserved better treatment than 19th-century architecture could provide. Political pressure mounted throughout the 1980s for closure of institutions that represented obsolete approaches to criminal justice. Adelaide Gaol became symbol of punitive policies that modern criminology had rejected, architectural approaches that contemporary penology had abandoned, governmental attitudes toward human dignity that democratic society was trying to transcend. The end arrived through bureaucratic transfer order rather than dramatic confrontation or public scandal. Quiet administrative decision reflecting changing priorities, budget constraints, and professional standards rather than moral awakening or philosophical transformation. Adelaide Gaol would close not because society had recognized the inherent cruelty of its methods, but because those methods had become expensive, inefficient, and legally problematic relative to available alternatives. 1888. The year marked on final transfer orders and closure directives. The end of 147 years of operation. From colonial experiment to historical artifact, from innovative architecture to obsolete infrastructure, from solution to problem, from symbol of progress to symbol of everything that progressive criminal justice sought to leave behind. The closure marked more than institutional transition. It marked the end of faith in architectural solutions to social problems, the abandonment of belief that proper building design could reshape human character, the rejection of theory that suggested criminal behavior could be corrected through environmental manipulation and spatial control. Decommissioning procedures revealed the true scope of what Adelaide Gaol had become during its operational history. Keys inventoried by the thousands, each controlling access to spaces where human lives had been controlled, regulated, and ended according to procedures that had seemed reasonable to people who designed them. Wing after wing cleared of human presence that had given them purpose, leaving only empty cells, echoing corridors, and residual institutional energy, concentrated like radiation in spaces designed to contain and concentrate human misery. But decommissioning couldn't decompress the psychological energy that had accumulated within Adelaide Gaol's walls across nearly a century and a half of systematic human processing. Stone and iron that had absorbed fear, desperation, violence, and death couldn't be neutralized through administrative procedures or policy changes. The building had learned to be a prison, and learning had changed its essential character in ways that couldn't be erased through reclassification as historical site. The silence that followed closure was different from operational silence that had been imposed through architectural design and administrative discipline. Post-closure silence was environmental, natural, the product of removing human presence from spaces designed to control human presence. This silence revealed acoustic properties that had been masked by operational noise, how stone walls absorbed and reflected sound, how empty spaces created resonance that made individual voices seem small and powerless. The jail's conversion from working prison to preserved museum required careful navigation between historical accuracy and public safety, between authentic presentation and psychological protection. Visitors would need to experience genuine prison environments without being subjected to conditions that had been psychologically destructive to people who had lived in those environments. The challenge was presenting honest history, without recreating harmful experiences. Tours would follow routes that had been forbidden to most prisoners during operational years. Public access to spaces where access had been carefully controlled, regulated, and limited according to security requirements and administrative necessity. The irony was deliberate and educational. Freedom to explore buildings that had been designed to eliminate freedom. Tourism in spaces that had been specifically engineered to be unwelcoming. But the most significant transformation was psychological rather than architectural. Adelaide Gaol flipped overnight from feared institution to historical curiosity, from active threat to preserved memory, from operational facility to educational resource. The public that had spent generations avoiding the building now paid admission fees to enter spaces they had previously tried never to approach. The conversion revealed how much of the building's power had depended on function rather than form, operation rather than architecture, human presence rather than stone construction. Cells that had been terrifying when occupied by prisoners became historical curiosities when empty. Workshops that had been oppressive when filled with unpaid laborers became interesting examples of historical industrial techniques when devoid of human suffering. Even the hanging tower, once the building's most feared space, became educational opportunity when its scaffold was removed and its purpose relegated to museum interpretation. The room that had been designed for death became space for reflection on the historical relationship between governmental power and individual mortality, between legal authority and human dignity. But conversion to museum status couldn't resolve fundamental questions about the relationship between historical memory and contemporary entertainment. Should spaces where systematic human suffering had occurred be transformed into recreational destinations? Could tourism serve educational purposes without trivializing historical trauma? How should democratic society remember institutions it had created, operated, and eventually rejected as incompatible with democratic values? Adelaide Gaol's evolution from prison to museum forced these questions into public conversation in ways that academic discussion alone could never accomplish. Visitors walking through authentic cells would confront physical evidence of their society's capacity for institutional cruelty. They would stand in spaces where human beings had been deliberately broken while considering their own relationship to systems of power that continued to operate in modified forms. But the building's most persistent influence proved to be atmospheric rather than educational, psychological rather than intellectual. Adelaide Gaol had accumulated more than a century of concentrated human pain, fear, desperation, and death within walls designed to contain and amplify such emotions. That energy couldn't be neutralized through administrative procedures, erased through historical interpretation, or controlled through museum management. The reports began almost immediately after closure and continued with remarkable consistency across subsequent decades. Sightings that couldn't be explained through conventional understanding of how empty buildings behave. Sounds that had no identifiable source in mechanical or structural systems. Experiences that felt unmistakably human but couldn't be attributed to human presence. Temperature variations that defied meteorological explanation. Electromagnetic anomalies that confused recording equipment and communication devices. Whether these phenomena reflected supernatural activity or psychological response to historically traumatic environments, they served similar cultural function. They ensured that Adelaide Gaol's history remained immediate rather than distant, visceral rather than academic, present rather than past. The building refused to allow its operational history to be safely relegated to textbooks, guided tours, and scholarly interpretation. Ghost tours became one of Adelaide Gaol's most popular attractions, drawing visitors who came seeking paranormal experience rather than historical education. But supernatural tourism served historical purposes, whether it intended to or not. Visitors attracted by reports of ghostly activity encountered authentic historical spaces and learned, often accidentally, about institutional practices their society had once considered normal, necessary, and morally justified. The jail had discovered new life as repository of fear, but fear of different kind than it had originally been designed to generate. Instead of fear of legal consequences for criminal behavior, it now produced fear of historical consequences for institutional behavior. Instead of teaching individuals to respect governmental authority, it encouraged society to question institutional power. Instead of reinforcing existing social hierarchies, it promoted examination of how power structures had developed and how they might be reformed. Modern paranormal investigators equipped with electronic monitoring devices recorded electromagnetic signatures, temperature fluctuations, and acoustic anomalies that seemed to correlate with spaces where historical trauma had been most concentrated. The hanging tower generated particular attention from researchers who documented energy patterns that had no apparent source in mechanical or electrical systems. But perhaps the most significant discovery was that Adelaide Gaol's haunted reputation had made it no place criminals dared enter long before its official closure. The building's history of systematic execution, its reputation for successful hanging procedures, its identity as factory for judicial death, had created psychological barriers that proved more effective than physical security measures. The real reason no criminal dared enter wasn't supernatural. It was systematic. Reputation as secondary perimeter fence forged through architectural authority, administrative secrecy, and 45 hangings that had taught the criminal underworld a simple lesson. Some places don't just punish you for breaking laws, they keep you permanently, processing your existence through procedures that end in death rather than release. This reputation had extended far beyond Adelaide Gaol's immediate vicinity, spreading throughout Australia's criminal networks like folklore that carried factual weight. Stories about the jail's execution efficiency, its procedural reliability, its track record of converting judicial decisions into corpses according to schedule. Professional criminals learned to avoid South Australia not because its laws were stricter, but because its enforcement included machinery for permanent elimination of persistent offenders. The jail's reputation had become a self-reinforcing deterrent system that operated independently of its actual policies or procedures. Fear of Adelaide Gaol prevented crimes that might have resulted in sentences to Adelaide Gaol, creating crime prevention through terror rather than justice. The building had achieved the ultimate correctional goal. It had made itself unnecessary by becoming so feared that potential criminals chose other jurisdictions or other professions. But reputation-based deterrence came at cost measured in human dignity, democratic values, and social trust. A justice system that relied on fear rather than fairness, terror rather than rehabilitation, elimination rather than integration had achieved order through methods that contradicted the moral foundations of ordered society. Adelaide Gaol had worked exactly as designed, and its success was precisely what made it ultimately unacceptable. The building's final lesson was perhaps its most important. Effective institutions are not necessarily good institutions. Successful programs are not necessarily humane programs. Working systems are not necessarily just systems. Adelaide Gaol had functioned efficiently for nearly 150 years, processing thousands of human beings through procedures that had been refined through experience and improved through technological innovation. But efficiency in processing human beings toward death is not the same as justice in treating human beings with dignity. And so, the jail became what it remains today, a preserved reminder of society's capacity for systematic cruelty disguised as systematic justice, Institutional violence presented as institutional order, governmental killing marketed as governmental protection. The silence that fills its empty cells and corridors carries the voices of everyone who lived and died within its walls, everyone who built and operated its machinery, everyone who believed that proper architecture could solve improper human behavior. The last sound, when it finally comes, is not a scream or a prayer or a confession. It is a key turning in a lock that no longer has a job except to remind visitors what the building was designed to do, what it accomplished during its operational years, and what questions it raises about the relationship between governmental power and human dignity in societies that claim to value both order and justice. But the key keeps turning, because the questions keep demanding answers, and the answers keep proving that some buildings teach lessons their builders never intended to include in the curriculum. The preservation of Adelaide Gaol as historical site created an unprecedented opportunity for collective examination of institutional conscience. Visitors could walk through spaces where democratic society had systematically brutalized human beings while convincing itself that brutality served humane purposes. They could stand in cells where individuals had been broken while considering how institutions develop capacity for systematic breaking. They could examine execution apparatus while questioning the relationship between governmental authority and human mortality. But perhaps the most profound educational opportunity lay in the building's continued existence itself. Adelaide Gaol had survived because it was too historically significant to demolish, too architecturally impressive to ignore, too symbolically important to forget. Its preservation forced ongoing conversation about values, methods, and consequences that society might otherwise prefer to bury in archives accessible only to scholars and specialists. The jail's story continued beyond its operational closure because the questions it raised had no expiration date. How does democratic society prevent itself from developing institutions that contradict democratic principles? How do citizens maintain oversight of governmental power when that power operates behind walls designed to prevent oversight? How does legal system maintain legitimacy when its methods undermine the human dignity that law exists to protect? These questions proved especially urgent because the conditions that had created Adelaide Gaol continued to exist in modified forms. Social inequality that generated crime, political pressure for simple solutions to complex problems, public appetite for punishment that felt proportionate to public fear, economic incentives that made imprisonment profitable for some while expensive for others, architectural thinking that assumed environmental manipulation could produce behavioral modification. Contemporary correctional facilities incorporated lessons learned from Adelaide Gaol's failures, but they also incorporated technologies and theories that had been refined through institutions like Adelaide Gaol. Modern prisons used electronic surveillance instead of guard towers, but the goal remained the same: total observation of controlled populations. Contemporary facilities emphasized rehabilitation over punishment, but they still relied on confinement, isolation, and environmental control to achieve their goals. The jail's preserved spaces served as laboratory for examining these continuities and discontinuities between historical and contemporary approaches to criminal justice. Visitors could compare 19th-century cells with 21st-century housing units, historical workshop programs with modern vocational training, past execution procedures with present life sentences. The building provided physical baseline for measuring progress and identifying persistent problems. But Adelaide Gaol's most important legacy might be its demonstration of the distance between institutional intention and institutional outcome. The building had been designed according to progressive theories about crime causation, criminal psychology, and rehabilitative intervention. Its architects and administrators had believed they were creating humane alternatives to less scientific approaches to criminal justice. They had intended to build institutions that would benefit both prisoners and society through application of advanced thinking about human behavior and social control. The gap between intention and achievement illustrated fundamental problems in institutional design that extended far beyond correctional philosophy. Well-meaning people had created harmful institutions because they had misunderstood the relationship between environmental control and human development, between architectural authority and personal growth, between systematic intervention and individual dignity. These misunderstandings had been enabled by distance between institutional designers and institutional subjects, architects who never had to live in cells they designed, administrators who went home every night to comfortable houses, politicians who voted for imprisonment policies while their own children attended private schools and received family support that made criminal behavior unlikely, judges who imposed sentences while remaining personally immune to the conditions those sentences created. Adelaide Gaol preserved evidence of what happened when institutional power operated without meaningful accountability to institutional impact. The building demonstrated how systematic harm could be generated by people who believed they were systematic helpers, how human dignity could be degraded by policies presented as human improvement, how democratic values could be undermined by institutions created to protect democratic society. But preservation also created opportunities for different kinds of learning. Educational programs that brought students into direct contact with historical spaces where abstract concepts about justice, power, and human rights had been translated into concrete experiences of control, punishment, and elimination. Artistic installations that used the jail's architecture as canvas for exploring contemporary questions about freedom, dignity, and social responsibility. Community events that transform spaces of isolation into spaces of connection, historical sites of systematic dehumanization into contemporary venues for celebrating human creativity and resilience. The building that had been designed to separate people from society became a place where society could gather to examine its own capacity for both cruelty and compassion, both institutional failure and institutional learning. Theatrical performances in the jail's preserved spaces created particularly powerful educational experiences. Actors performing in cells where real prisoners had been confined, audiences sitting in spaces where real guards had worked and real administrators had made decisions about real human lives. Drama that blurred boundaries between historical reenactment and contemporary reflection, between entertainment and education, between past trauma and present responsibility. Research programs used Adelaide Gaol as field laboratory for interdisciplinary study of institutional history, architectural psychology, criminal justice evolution, and social memory. Historians collaborated with architects, criminologists worked with psychologists, sociologists partnered with artists. The building became focal point for scholarship that crossed academic boundaries while addressing questions that transcended academic disciplines. International delegations visited Adelaide Gaol to study its architecture, examine its operational history, and compare its methods with correctional approaches in other countries. The building became case study in global conversations about human rights, criminal justice reform, and the proper limits of governmental power over individual citizens. Its preservation served purposes that extended far beyond local historical education. But perhaps the most significant ongoing impact was atmospheric. Adelaide Gaol continued to feel like a prison even when it functioned as museum. Its walls retained a psychological weight that couldn't be neutralized through administrative reclassification or educational programming. Visitors experienced emotional and physical responses to spaces that had been designed to generate such responses. The building taught through environmental impact as much as intellectual content. Temperature fluctuations that had no meteorological explanation, acoustic phenomena that suggested presence without visible source, electromagnetic readings that fluctuated in patterns that correlated with historical trauma. Whether these effects reflected supernatural activity or psychological response to architecturally concentrated human suffering, they ensured that Adelaide Gaol's history remained immediate, visceral, undeniable. The building had become portal between past and present, between historical experience and contemporary awareness, between abstract knowledge and embodied understanding. Visitors couldn't remain intellectually detached from institutional history when that history surrounded them physically, acoustically, psychologically. They experienced prison rather than simply learning about prison, felt institutional power rather than merely studying institutional power. This experiential education proved more effective than traditional historical instruction because it engaged multiple senses and multiple levels of consciousness simultaneously. Visitors learned about Adelaide Gaol through their bodies as well as their minds. through emotional response as well as intellectual analysis, through personal experience as well as historical information. But the building's continued ability to generate powerful psychological responses also raised ethical questions about the responsibilities that accompanied preservation of traumatic spaces. Should historical sites deliberately recreate conditions that had been psychologically harmful to their original occupants? Could educational goals justify exposing visitors to environments designed to break human spirits? How should society balance historical accuracy with psychological safety? These questions remained unresolved because they involved fundamental tensions between competing values: truth versus comfort, education versus protection, historical accuracy versus contemporary sensibility. Adelaide Gaol embodied these tensions in ways that made them impossible to ignore or resolve through simple administrative decisions. The building's complexity resisted simple interpretation or comfortable conclusions. It had been simultaneously progressive and regressive, innovative and traditional, humane and brutal. It had served legitimate social needs through illegitimate social methods. It had protected society from dangerous individuals while creating danger for individuals who might have been protected through different methods. Adelaide Gaol forced recognition that institutional history was always more complicated than institutional mythology, that progressive policies could produce regressive outcomes, that good intentions could create harmful consequences. The building taught skepticism about simple solutions to complex problems, wariness about reformist claims that weren't supported by reformist results. But it also demonstrated human capacity for institutional learning, social evolution, and moral progress. The fact that Adelaide Gaol had been closed, converted, and preserved represented recognition that its methods had been wrong, that better approaches were possible, that society could acknowledge institutional failures while working to prevent their repetition. The jail's transformation from operational prison to educational museum illustrated the difference between societies that defend their institutions, regardless of institutional outcomes, and societies that examine their institutions according to institutional impacts. Democratic societies' willingness to preserve evidence of its own institutional failures represented commitment to learning that authoritarian systems typically avoided. But preservation also carried responsibility for ongoing education, continued examination, and persistent vigilance against the social conditions that had created Adelaide Gaol in the first place. The building served as warning about human capacity for systematic cruelty disguised as systematic justice, but warnings were only effective if people paid attention to them and learned from them. The final lesson of Adelaide Gaol was perhaps the most important and most difficult. Institutions reflect the societies that create them, and institutional change requires social change at levels that extend far beyond policy modification or administrative reform. Buildings like Adelaide Gaol emerged from social conditions, political pressures, and cultural assumptions that couldn't be changed through architectural design or correctional programming alone. Real institutional transformation required transformation of the inequality that generated crime, the fear that demanded punishment, the distance that enabled cruelty, and the power structures that made systematic harm seem like systematic help. Adelaide Gaol had been symptom as much as cause, effect as much as generator, product as much as producer of social problems that extended far beyond its walls, and so the building waited in its preserved state, holding its complicated history like secrets that demanded telling, housing questions that required answers, containing lessons that needed learning. The silence that filled its empty corridors carried voices of everyone who had been processed through its machinery, everyone who had operated its systems, everyone who had believed that proper institutions could solve improper human problems. In that silence, the key continued to turn, not because locks still needed opening or closing, but because the questions Adelaide Gaol raised about power, justice, dignity, and institutional responsibility would continue to require answers as long as democratic societies continued to create institutions in the name of protecting democratic values. The building had become what it would remain, a preserved question about the relationship between what societies claim to believe and what societies actually build, between stated values and institutional practices, between democratic ideals and democratic realities. And like all good questions, it offered no simple answers, only ongoing opportunities for examination, reflection, and the kind of institutional learning that prevented repetition of institutional failure. The last sound was indeed a key turning in a lock, but the lock it opened led not to freedom or confinement, but to understanding. And understanding, once begun, proved as persistent and inescapable as the stone walls that contained it.